Before the world stirs, before the sun stretches its arms across the eastern sky, there is a hush, a breath held by the earth itself. It is in this sacred pause between night and day that a single bell rings. Its tone is neither loud nor startling, but round, soft, resonant. It doesn't demand attention. It offers it, a gentle invitation, like a warm hand extended in silence, to enter into something older than language and vaster than thought. This bell is the beginning of our journey. In the Buddhist tradition, dawn is more than a time of day. It is a metaphor for awakening, the breaking of darkness, not as an enemy vanquished, but as a veil tenderly lifted. And just as the world passes gradually from shade to light, so too does the human heart unfold in its own season. No enlightenment is forced, no compassion rushed. Everything in this journey flows like morning mist over a rice field, slow, soft, inevitable. As the bell's vibration dissolves into stillness, we begin to remember something we never truly forgot, that the world aches, and so do we. And yet within that ache lies the very seed of our healing. We begin here not because it is easy, but because the heart knows how to listen when the world is quiet. This first light of awareness doesn't blaze, it glows. It reveals rather than shouts. And it is here in this hour of soft illumination that we gather to listen to stories, not just to be entertained, but to be restored, to remember. You see, stories, real, imagined, ancient, and whispered, have always held the architecture of healing. Before sutras, before scrolls, before scripture etched into stone, there were stories passed from breath to breath, from teacher to student, from mother to child, beneath trees, beside rivers, in the hush between temple bells. These were not stories of conquest or certainty. They were parables of suffering met with tenderness, tales of ordinary people who chose compassion over pride, silence over anger, presence over self. It is easy to overlook the significance of a simple tale. We live in a world so hungry for answers that we forget the value of a good question. And that is what these stories are, luminous questions, wrapped in gentle parables. What does it mean to give without expecting? What happens when we sit with another's pain, not to fix it, but simply to witness? How does one bow without losing dignity? And can a scar become something beautiful? As the sky blushes with the promise of the sun, we begin this journey together, not as experts, not even as seekers, but as companions. Companions who will walk barefoot through fields of story, past temples of silence and rivers of memory, towards something quiet and sacred and whole. This is not a journey of escape. Buddhism does not promise a life free of sorrow. Instead, it offers us a way to befriend our suffering, to meet it like a monk meeting a stranger in the rain, with a smile, with robes soaked through, with the quiet courage to remain. And so, in these coming hours, you will hear tales drawn from old sutras, from village lore, from half-forgotten scrolls, and the everyday miracles of human lives lived gently. You will hear of monks who offered their last bowl of rice to a hungry ghost, of children who bowed before insects, of silent teachers whose greatest lesson was a gaze, or a tear, or a broom brushing temple stone. These stories do not scream their meaning, they bloom, and like the morning lotus, they open only in stillness. Listen carefully, not just with your ears, but with that quiet space behind your ribs, where understanding lives not in logic but in love. You may find along the way that a story stays with you, a detail, an image, a gesture, a bell that continues to echo in your mind long after its final tone. That is no accident. The teachings in these tales are not meant to be consumed. They are meant to be planted. A single act of kindness you hear about tonight may become a soft word you speak to yourself tomorrow, or a pause before judgment, or a bow to your own brokenness. This is the medicine of Buddhist storytelling. Not escape but embrace. Not dogma but direction. Not prescription but presence. As light slowly spills across the horizon, we invite you to open the window of your heart and let these stories in. They may arrive as whispers, as old friends, as memories not your own but deeply familiar. And if you allow them, they will sit beside you quietly, like monks in meditation, offering not answers, but a tender space to rest. Let this soft bell at dawn be your invitation to enter a space outside of time, to listen with reverence, to feel without rushing, to heal in the company of quiet truths. The path does not begin with certainty. It begins with stillness, and from that stillness we step forward, together. Between one story and the next there is a breath. It is not filler. It is not pause for effect. It is space, intentional, sacred. It is in this breath that something remarkable happens. Not outwardly visible, perhaps not even nameable. But it is in that moment between tales, before the next character speaks, before the next lesson unfolds, that the heart stirs quietly and begins to ask, what is compassion? Not as a concept, but as a way of being. Too often, compassion is mistaken for a simple kindness, a soft gesture, a warm word. But the compassion of the Buddhist path is not soft in the sense of being weak. It is soft in the way earth is soft, yielding, yes, but capable of holding everything: grief, rage, beauty, and brokenness. It is the kind of softness that can cradle sorrow without shattering. Imagine a leaf drifting gently to the ground. Its fall is quiet, but its journey is profound. Compassion, in its truest form, is like that leaf. It meets life exactly where it is, without resisting, without recoiling. It does not need to fix. It does not rush to speak. It is enough, in compassion, simply to be fully present. The Buddha described compassion, karuna, as one of the four immeasurables, boundless qualities of the awakened heart. But even that language, immeasurable, is not metaphor. True compassion does not count or measure. It does not weigh merit or ask whether someone is deserving. It flows freely, like water offered to every root, not just the flowering ones. This may sound ideal, perhaps even unattainable. But look closer, not outward, but inward. Consider the times you have held a friend's grief without knowing what to say, or the way your chest tightens when you see someone in pain, even if they are a stranger. These moments, these instinctive responses, are the flickers of compassion already alive within you. Not something to be built from scratch, but remembered. In ancient Buddhist texts, there is a story of the Bodhisattva Avalokitevara, she who hears the cries of the world. It is said that she vowed never to enter nirvana until every being had found freedom from suffering. And when the cries became too many, her body shattered from the strain, but from the pieces, she was reborn with 1,000 arms, each hand holding an eye, so she could both see and reach all who suffer. This is not just mythology. It is metaphor with marrow. The arms of Avalokitevara are not separate from our own. Every time we reach out, to console, to listen, to forgive, we become one of her hands. Every time we see suffering and choose not to look away, we become one of her eyes. Compassion is not a grand performance. It is quiet, often invisible. A mother stirring soup with tears in her eyes. A teacher noticing the silence of a child. A monk walking barefoot through cold streets offering no sermon, only presence. These small moments are the true temple of compassion. And yet, to truly live compassion requires more than sentiment. It calls for courage. The courage to stay with what hurts. To let another's sorrow enter your being without trying to extinguish it. To bear witness to suffering without turning it into a personal achievement. True compassion is not about you. It is about what moves through you. There is a well-known koan, a kind of Zen riddle, that asks, what is the sound of one hand clapping? But perhaps the more useful question in our time is, what is the shape of compassion in a broken world? Is it stillness? Is it movement? Is it prayer? Or protest? In Buddhist practice, we are taught that true compassion arises only when we stop seeing others as separate from ourselves. When the illusion of us and them dissolves, what remains is an aching tenderness that cannot help but respond. not because we are told to, but because it is who we are. There is a story from the Pali Canon where a monk named Punna seeks permission from the Buddha to travel to a land known for its violence. The Buddha warns him, "They may insult you, beat you, kill you." But Punna replies, "If they beat me, I will think they are still better than those who kill. If they kill me, I will think, at least they freed me from the body." The Buddha, hearing this, says, "You are ready." Punna was not naive. He did not seek suffering, but he understood that compassion, when rooted in wisdom, is indestructible. It does not depend on outcome. It flows regardless of how the world receives it. You might wonder, how does this relate to the stories we are about to hear? Everything. Because each parable is an expression of compassion made visible. In the tale of the monk who fed a thief, in the woman who welcomed a dying dog into her home, in the child who shared his only blanket with a ghost. These are not just stories, they are mirrors, and they invite you to ask, not abstractly but personally, what would compassion look like in your hands, your voice, your breath? It is said that the Buddha's last words were, "All compounded things are subject to dissolution. Strive on with diligence." And what is compassion, if not the diligent response to the truth of impermanence? We know everything we love will fade, and still we choose to love. That is compassion. So, let this moment, the breath between stories, be more than silence. Let it be a soft doorway into the marrow of your own life. Ask yourself gently, where has compassion touched me? Where have I turned away from it? And where might I begin again? Because each act of compassion, however small, ripples through time. A whispered kindness today may blossom a generation from now. A listening ear may prevent a war. A bow to another's dignity may heal wounds unseen. This is the breath between stories, still luminous and full of possibility. Now we turn the page. In the first blush of morning, when the light drips like honey through the mist, wrapped bamboo groves of the eastern hills, there once lived an old bamboo cutter named Ishin. He was not famous, nor wealthy, nor learned. His back was bent like the arc of a crescent moon, his robes patched and colorless. But he moved through the forest with a grace that came not from ambition, but from quiet companionship with the trees he harvested. Each morning, he would rise before the sun and walk the winding path into the green hush of the forest. He did not speak. He bowed to each grove as he entered. His blade was sharp, but his hand was slow. He took only what was needed and whispered thanks as each stalk fell. The villagers believed Ishin was odd. Too gentle, they said, to make a proper living. But his bundles of bamboo were always perfectly trimmed, tied with care, and brought to the market with humble dignity. One morning, as the mists curled low and the birds had not yet begun their songs, Ishin entered a familiar clearing. It was a place he loved, where the bamboo swayed like prayer flags in the wind and sunlight rarely reached the ground. But on this morning, something had changed. There, curled in the base of the grove, was a small white fox, its flank pierced by an arrow. Blood stained the green leaves like falling plum petals. Ishin froze. The fox lifted its head, barely. Its eyes wide and unblinking met his. No sound passed between them, but something deeper stirred. A recognition beneath language. The old man knelt, setting his blade aside. Gently he broke the shaft of the arrow and wrapped the fox in his own robe. He carried it home, tucked close to his chest, as if it were a child. For 3 days, Ishin tended the creature. He boiled herbs, he whispered sutras. He warmed rice in a wooden bowl and let the fox drink from his cupped hands. On the 4th morning, the fox was gone. In its place, in the center of the floor, was a single perfect stalk of black bamboo, smooth, elegant, and unlike any he had ever seen. Its surface shimmered with a soft iridescence, as if it had been carved from the night sky itself. Word of the strange bamboo spread. Merchants offered silver for it. Nobles sent servants to inquire. but Ishin refused them all. He kept the black bamboo in a cup of water beside his altar. "It is not for sale," he would say. "It was a gift given for mercy, and it must remain so." Years passed. Ishin grew older slower. His walks into the forest became fewer. The villagers, once skeptical, began to seek his advice. They said his words soothed them, like wind passing through reeds. They asked how he had lived so long in such peace. He would smile and say, "I listened, and I learned to leave things be." One winter evening, just before his death, a child from the village asked him what had happened to the fox. The old man, lying beneath blankets woven with straw, opened his eyes slowly and said, "The fox was not a fox, it was suffering, and it asked not to be solved, but to be seen." After Ishin passed, the villagers came to honor him. They found the black bamboo still beside the altar, taller now, though no one had watered it for years. And in that room, though it was the dead of winter, there was the unmistakable scent of spring, of rain on moss and blossoms waiting. No one knows what became of the bamboo. Some say it withered. Others say it still grows, hidden in the heart of the forest. But the villagers remember Ishin's story. They tell it to their children, not as a tale of magic, but as a lesson in presence. The world is full of wounds, some visible, some hidden beneath fur or silence or pride. And not every wound asks to be cured. Some ask simply to be carried, gently, with the kind of mercy that does not demand recognition. That is the awakening the old bamboo cutter lived, not in retreat from the world's pain, but in humble relationship with it. Compassion in the shape of a bowed back, mercy in a cup of water and a warm robe, and awakening, not as a flash of insight, but as a life quietly lived in rhythm with the breathing forest. And if you ever walk through bamboo at dawn, listen. You may still hear the echo of his footsteps, the rhythm of a man who chose to cut only what was needed, and to mend what could be mended with love. In the amber hush of late morning, when shadows soften and the world begins to settle into the fullness of day, there lived a potter in a small village near the river's bend. His name was Riku, and though he was not known beyond the borders of his village, his bowls and jars were treasured by all who touched them. There was a quiet warmth to his creations, an honesty in their shape, as if each had been formed not just by skilled hands, but by a listening heart. Riku had worked clay since he was a boy, having learned from his mother, who had learned from hers. But it was said that what set his work apart was not his technique, nor the richness of his glaze, but his acceptance of imperfection. While others discarded flawed vessels, Riku held them gently, like children who had stumbled while learning to walk. His shelves were lined not just with symmetry, but with stories. Pots that leaned slightly to the left, jars with lips that curled like quiet smiles, bowls that bore faint cracks like rivers winding through dry earth. He once said, "The fire reveals what the hands cannot hide, but a crack is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of another." One such bowl came to be known throughout the village, not for its utility, but for the silence it invoked. It had been shaped on a spring afternoon, during a time when Riku's heart was heavy with unspoken grief. His wife had passed some seasons earlier, and though he moved through his days with kindness, there was a sorrow behind his eyes that not even time could smooth. He didn't notice the hairline fracture until the bowl came out of the kiln, fine but unmistakable, like a thread pulled tight across porcelain skin. He almost set it aside, as others might have, but something in that line caught him. A tenderness, a truth. Instead of hiding it, he filled the crack with gold, not to mask the wound, but to honor it, to let it shine. This was not invention. The ancient Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, was born from a philosophy that brokenness need not be hidden, that the mark of damage could, in fact, become the most beautiful part. That healing, when done with care and reverence, enhances rather than diminishes. Riku's bowl, golden veined and humble, became a kind of cone. People would visit just to see it, to hold it in their hands. Some wept without knowing why. One day, a traveler arrived from a distant province, seeking the potter whose work made silence louder. She had heard whispers of the bowl and asked to buy it for a great sum. Riku shook his head gently and said, "This bowl is already full. It does not need more." The traveler asked, "Full of what?" "Full of its own story," he replied. "And that story is not mine to sell." Over time, the bowl came to rest on the altar in the village's temple, not because it was sacred in the formal sense, but because it carried something wordless, something that people recognized in themselves. The crack, rimmed in gold, became a mirror to their own hidden aches, a reminder that what had been broken might also become beloved. We are taught, often without words, to hide what is fractured, to mend invisibly, to speak only of healing once the wound is gone. But the Dharma does not look away from the scar. It leans in, it bows to it. In Buddhist practice, the lotus blooms in the mud. The Bodhisattva vows not to transcend suffering, but to walk with it. And so too, the bowl that was broken did not seek perfection, but intimacy, a joining of wound and wisdom. Riku lived many more years, though he made fewer pots as his hands stiffened. Still, he would sit on his porch in the afternoon sun, listening to the wind through the bamboo, the same wind that once carried his wife's laughter. He often held the golden, veined bowl in his lap like a prayer. Not fragile, not flawless, but whole. There are stories that sing with drama, heroes, villains, miracles. This is not one of them. This is a story of quiet repair, of one man who refused to throw something away simply because it had changed, of a philosophy not of conquest, but of care. And perhaps this too is awakening, to see that the point of fracture is not the end, but the invitation. That compassion begins not when we are whole, but when we are brave enough to cradle the pieces, to fill them not with shame, but with gold. Let this story rest within you like a warm bowl in the palms. Feel its weight, its warmth, and know that the cracks you carry are not yours to conceal. They are yours to gild with tenderness and truth. In the golden heat of afternoon, when the world hums with the pulse of life and decay, there bloomed a lotus where no one thought to look, in a narrow alley behind a rusted row of tin-roofed shacks, where broken glass glittered like false stars and the air carried the scent of ash and rain. Her name was Amara. She was 10 years old, with eyes the color of wet earth and a smile that rose like steam from morning rice. She lived with her grandmother in a single-room dwelling built from scrap wood and soft prayers. The world around her was loud and hard, arguments between neighbors, the distant bark of stray dogs, the ever-present rumble of trucks passing with dust and promise. Yet Amara moved through it with the quiet dignity of one who knows the weight of silence. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, sweep the alley with a palm broom, and light a single stick of incense in a chipped clay bowl outside their door. For the spirits, she would say, and for those who forget they are still alive. She had no formal schooling, no books of her own, but she listened to the voices in the market, to the radio outside the chai stand, to the chanting from the nearby temple carried on the wind. She collected words like others collect coins, turning them over, polishing them in the dark, whispering them to the ants and birds and children smaller than herself. The old women in the slum said she had an old soul. The men said she had her grandmother's spirit. The monks who passed through from time to time said nothing, but always bowed when they saw her sweeping. There was a boy in the alley named Chaya, wild and thin, always shouting, always testing. One day, he kicked over Amara's incense bowl, laughing, saying, "Do ghosts even care about your stick of smoke?" Amara said nothing. She simply picked up the bowl, refilled it with ash from their hearth, and lit a new stick. The next morning, Chaya watched from the corner. The next week, he brought her a small piece of sandalwood he'd found in the gutter. A week after that, he began sweeping with her. What changes a heart? Not sermons, not punishment. Often, it is the steady presence of someone who does not flinch in the face of cruelty. Someone who sees past the storm and chooses quietly to remain. Amara's grandmother, Amma, was nearly blind, but her voice carried the cadence of wisdom passed down like an heirloom. In the evenings, she would sit on a low stool, grinding herbs, telling stories. Of the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, of hungry ghosts who could only be freed through acts of kindness, of a lotus that grew from the mud not in spite of its darkness, but because of it. Amara listened, and in her listening, she began to live the stories. One day a sick dog collapsed outside their door. Its body was gaunt, its eyes clouded. The neighbors shouted for someone to throw it out. Amara wrapped it in a blanket and placed a bowl of rice nearby. She sang to it softly through the night. It died the next morning, head resting in her lap, tail still. The temple monk, passing by, saw her burning incense beside the dog's body. "Why waste prayer on an animal?" a bystander asked. The monk looked at Amara, then said, "Because she remembers what we have forgotten." In Buddhist tradition, the lotus is the symbol of awakening, not because it is rare, but because it begins in mud. Thick black mud, and still it grows, rising through murky water, toward light it cannot yet see, opening slowly into bloom, the petals unstained, untouched by the filth below. Amara too was such a blossom, a child shaped by the soot of suffering, yet untouched by bitterness. Her kindness was not performative, it was elemental, like breath, like rain. Over time, others began to follow her lead, not from instruction, but from resonance. The alley became quieter. Children began leaving scraps of food for animals. Someone painted the walls with poems. An old man planted a neem tree, and though hunger still bit, and injustice still clawed at the edges, there was something in the air that felt almost sacred. Like the soft ringing of a bell you hadn't noticed until it stopped. Amara never claimed to know more than anyone. She never spoke of enlightenment. But when asked why she did what she did, she would sometimes smile and say, "Because it hurts less when I help." In a world that often demands grand gestures, her life was a parable of the subtle. She did not change policy. She changed presence. And in doing so, she lit 1,000 lamps no storm could extinguish. Years later, when her name had faded into local memory and the alley had changed faces, the neem tree remained. The incense bowl still sat beneath it, cracked but whole. And in the monsoon rains, lotuses sometimes bloomed in the puddles, briefly, brilliantly, before vanishing into the mud again. The slum had never been silent, but beneath the clamor, one could still feel it, a hush, a warmth, a breath, the trace of a girl named Amara, who bowed to what others ignored and offered the sacred without ever speaking its name. In the hush of early evening, when the sun rests low and the light stretches long and golden across the world, there was once a monk whose heart burned with a fire he could not name. His name was Tenzin, and he lived in a temple high in the northern hills, where the wind whispered sutras through the pine trees and the mountains stood like ancient, watching sages. Tenzin was young, but known already for his discipline. He rose before dawn. He memorized entire volumes of scripture. He sat motionless in meditation for hours. But beneath his stillness lived something restless. A storm coiled tightly beneath his ribs. When the novice monks made noise, he snapped at them. When an elder corrected his chanting, he clenched his jaw so tightly that his teeth ached through the night. And when his own thoughts betrayed him, memories, longings, shadows from his life before the robe, he struck the stone floor of his cell with his knuckles until they bled. The abbot watched him quietly for many months. He neither praised nor reprimanded. He waited, like the mountain itself. One morning, After a particularly sharp exchange with a fellow monk, Tenzin was summoned. He bowed low before the abbot, expecting punishment. But the old man only said, "You are to leave the temple for 7 days." Tenzin raised his head in confusion. "Where shall I go, master?" The abbot pointed east. "To the mirror lake. Take nothing but your bowl and your breath. Sit there and look." Tenzin, confused but obedient, did as he was told. He walked for half a day, descending through cedar groves and narrow deer trails, until he reached the lake, a wide, glassy pool cradled in stone, so still it seemed to hold the sky itself. Mountains bent over its surface like elders peering into their own fading memories. He sat at the edge and looked. The water reflected everything: the arc of trees above, the scatter of birds, his own face. And each time he looked, something shifted. His expression, his posture, the furrow of his brow. It was like watching the weather change inside a single body. At first, Tenzin grew frustrated. He tried to recite sutras to still his mind, but the wind carried his words away. He tried to discipline his breath, but it rebelled like a child. Finally, in his exhaustion, he simply sat, not in posture but in surrender, and he watched. What he saw was not serenity. It was pain. He saw the face of his mother, whom he had abandoned in anger when he left home. He saw the child he had once been, hiding behind temple walls not for spiritual insight, but from a sorrow he did not know how to name. He saw himself yelling, hurting, clenching, all the ways he had tried to control what he could not bear to feel. The mirror lake did not judge, it only showed. When the wind passed, the surface rippled, and even his face disappeared. And yet he remained, watching, breathing, returning again. On the 4th day, a heron landed nearby. It stood elegant and motionless, then dipped its beak into the water. Ripples spread. Tenzin watched his reflection distort, fragment vanish. And it was in that vanishing that something opened. A breath, a loosening. He did not know what it meant. He only wept. He wept for the child who had learned too early to be silent. He wept for the monks he had scolded. He wept for the years he had mistaken control for peace. And the lake held it all, as surely as it had held the sky. When he returned to the monastery, the abbot was sweeping the path of fallen leaves. Tenzin bowed forehead to the earth. "I saw," he said, "what I had been unwilling to see." The abbot nodded. "And did you understand?" Tenzin shook his head gently. "Not with my mind, but something softer in me does." The abbot placed the broom aside, then began again, this time with that softness. And so he did. Tenzin still rose before dawn. He still memorized verses, but his discipline no longer came from fear, it came from care. He sat beside the novices when they were troubled. He listened more than he spoke. When anger stirred within him, as it still did on occasion, he did not strike the floor. He closed his eyes and remembered the heron, the water, the way even pain could dissolve when met with stillness. In Buddhist teaching, the mirror is a symbol of mind, clear, reflective, ungrasping. But few teachings speak of what happens when the mirror shows us not just the world, but the wounds we carry within it. Awakening is not always a lightning flash. Sometimes it is a quiet gaze held long enough that the mask cracks. Sometimes it is 7 days by a lake, watching your own face disappear. And this, too, is compassion, not a gesture outward, but an inward mercy, the willingness to see ourselves without turning away, to let the reflection ripple, to let the water show us not perfection but truth. Because once we can look upon our own pain with tenderness, we are far less likely to inflict it on others. And perhaps this is the heart of the path, not to purify the self into something untouched, but to become like the lake, vast, still and capable of holding even the stormiest sky. As twilight slips softly into the creases of the world, when the air grows cool and the outlines of things begin to blur, the line between the seen and unseen grows thin. In many Buddhist cultures, it is said that dusk is when the hungry ghosts awaken, those spirits caught in longing, wandering among us with bellies that cannot be filled, eyes that search but do not see. They are not evil. They are lost, and sometimes they are closer than we think. In a small village nestled between rice fields and forest, there lived an old widow named Sopa. Her hands were weathered like old wood, her back curved like the crescent moon. She had no family left, no visitors, no riches, but her house was always swept, and there was always rice in the pot. Sopa was not educated. She could not read scriptures, but every evening, just before nightfall, she would place a small bowl of rice outside her door. No salt, no oil, just plain warm rice. When asked why, she would say, "It is for those who have no hands to hold, no mouths to ask, for the ones still hungry in ways we cannot see." Some in the village called her foolish. Others feared her. A few children whispered that she fed the dead. Sopa would smile and say nothing. She did not need to explain. Her offering was not for praise, nor was it superstition. It was remembrance. Years before, she had lost a son to fever, a boy with bright eyes and a voice like bird song. His name was Tashi, and his laughter had once filled the house like morning light. After he died, Sopa stopped speaking for nearly a season. But one evening, as she sat watching the sky bleed into indigo, she thought she heard his footsteps outside. Light familiar. Just beyond the door, she opened it. No one was there. Only the wind. Only the hush. That night, she cooked rice and placed a bowl on the step. "In case you are still walking," she whispered. And so began the ritual, every night without fail for decades. She did not ask who came. Sometimes the rice was gone by morning. Sometimes not. Sometimes a single grain was missing. Other times, there were footprints in the dust. Once, on the night of the new moon, she found a withered flower laid beside the bowl. Buddhist texts speak of pretas, hungry ghosts trapped by unfulfilled desire, those who, in life, clung so tightly to anger or attachment that even in death, they cannot release. Their suffering is profound, not because of punishment, but because of hunger without rest. In some stories, they are depicted with swollen bellies and thin necks, unable to swallow even kindness. But in others, they are quieter, shadows of grief, fragments of memory, old regrets that linger like scent in an empty room. Sopa, without doctrine or robe, understood this intuitively. She did not try to save the ghosts. She simply fed them. Compassion at its most luminous does not always seek to fix. It does not demand transformation. Sometimes it is enough to offer a warm bowl, to say in gesture, "What words cannot I see you? You are not forgotten." There came a time when Sopa herself fell ill. The village knew, and they came. Those who had once mocked, those who had long forgotten her name. They brought fruit and medicine and stories of the bowls of rice they had begun offering outside their own doors. Sopa, too weak to rise, smiled faintly and said, "Then the ghosts will no longer walk so far." On the night she passed, the sky was clear and the moon sharp as a silver blade. Her door, as always, was open. The last bowl of rice still steamed, and in the morning it was empty, save for a single white feather resting inside. No one claimed it. No one needed to. The villagers continued her practice, and in time, it became a custom on the 7th night of every moon. Bowls of rice would appear on doorsteps throughout the village. Some believed it brought peace to the dead. Others said it softened the hearts of the living. But all agreed on one thing: the air felt lighter, the dreams less heavy. There is a line in the Dhammapada: hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. But perhaps hunger too finds rest not through satisfaction, but through recognition. To be seen, to be offered something freely, even if you no longer have hands to take it. In this story, there is no dramatic awakening, no chanting under trees, only rice, only dusk, only the gentle wisdom of a woman who remembered what most had forgotten. That sometimes the simplest offering is the most sacred. That healing may come not from what we teach, but from what we continue to give night after night, even when no one sees. Even the dead, it seems, are nourished by love. As the sun reaches its highest point, and the day hums with life, there exists a stillness beneath the noise, like the hush of a single breath held in the heart of a crowd. It is in this fullness of day, when shadows shrink and the heat presses close, that the boldest acts of compassion often unfold. Not with trumpets or proclamations, but in gestures so small, they're nearly invisible. In this light, we meet someone whose generosity rippled quietly across lives, like wind over the surface of a pond. His name was Danu, and he was a beggar. Not the kind with cunning eyes or rehearsed desperation. Danu was the kind who did not look up when he extended his bowl. He did not ask. He waited, and in that waiting there was no bitterness, only patience, thick as dust on his robe, soft as the caluses on his feet. He had wandered for years, surviving on grains and chance kindness. Yet those who watched him closely noticed something strange. Though he had nothing, he often gave. Children would whisper that Danu was not a real beggar, because they had seen him offer coins to the old woman who sat coughing at the edge of the temple gate. They had watched him give his piece of fruit to a blind man beneath the banyan tree. Once, he was seen handing over his only blanket to a shivering dog during the coldest part of the night. "Why do you give when you have nothing?" a merchant asked him once, more annoyed than curious. Danu bowed, his eyes like still water. "Because I know what it is to need," he said. "And because I am not the only one." This simple answer puzzled many. Some called him foolish, others believed he was mad, but the monks at the monastery nearby began to pay attention. One in particular, a young novice named Leela, found herself watching Danu day after day. She began to notice how he sat at the same corner, not the most traveled, not the most profitable, but the one nearest the orphan's alley, where children often ran barefoot and unnoticed. She noticed that though his bowl was rarely full, he always found something to give. One evening, Leela approached him. "Are you a monk?" she asked. "You act like one." Danu smiled. No robes, no vows, just breath. She sat beside him. The smell of incense from the nearby shrine drifted on the wind. "Don't you ever wonder if you're giving too much?" she asked. "What if no one notices?" He turned his gaze toward the setting sun, then spoke slowly. "I do not give so others will notice. I give because the world is heavy, and sometimes I can lighten it, if only by the weight of one coin, one blanket, one kind look." That night, Leela wrote about him in her journal. The next day, she left half of her rice beside his sleeping mat. In the Buddhist tradition, the perfection of generosity, Dina Pyramid, is the first of the 6 pyramids, the virtues of the Bodhisattva path. It is not measured by quantity, but by spirit. A wealthy person may give gold and still hold back. A poor person may give their last crust of bread and reveal a treasure greater than any jewel. But Danu did not know scriptures. He only knew suffering, and he knew that the smallest acts, done with open hands, could become revolutions of the soul. One year a famine struck the region. Markets dried up, temple alms dwindled, even the monks tightened their belts and shortened their chants. Danu grew thinner, his cheeks hollowed and his legs trembled when he stood. Still he gave. One morning, he collapsed beneath a fig tree outside the village gate. When the villagers found him, his bowl held a torn piece of cloth and 3 grains of rice. Beside it, tucked gently beneath a leaf, was a lotus petal. No one knew who left it. Danu died quietly that afternoon, his breath leaving his body like a soft apology. The monks carried him to the cremation grounds with the same reverence they gave to their own. Years passed. The famine faded. New markets bloomed, but stories of the beggar who gave too much remained, not as legend, but as lesson. Young monks recited his name. The orphan children, now grown, spoke of him as one might speak of a beloved uncle. The fig tree where he passed became a place of rest, where strangers would sit and, without knowing why, feel a little lighter. And in time, no one remembered what Daniel looked like, but they remembered how they felt when they saw him. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy. Not all revolutions arrive with noise. Some come in silence, in a single coin passed hand to hand, in the echo of a kindness no one records. To give, even when the world says you have nothing, that is the beginning of liberation, for others, for yourself, for the world still aching to be seen. In the late afternoon, when the sky wears a coat of slate and the wind smells of wet earth, there is a softness that descends over the world, a quiet thick with waiting. This is the hour when even the restless begin to slow. And it was in such an hour long ago that a robe was used not for ritual or rank, but for love. Ananda, the Buddha's devoted attendant, is remembered in many sutras, not for miracles, not for sermons, but for his presence. He was the one who remembered all the Buddha's words, not as a scholar, but as a listener, the one who walked behind, who bowed often, who spoke with gentleness even to the cruel. But there is a lesser-known story, rarely cited, often whispered, of Ananda and the rain. It is said that while traveling through the central plains, the Buddha and his followers came upon a village struck by illness. The rains had come early that year, flooding the fields and breeding fever. The villagers were weak, their huts filled with coughs and quiet moaning. The monks, bound by discipline and ritual, hesitated. To enter the homes of the sick was to risk more than health. It was to risk purity, to blur the lines drawn between the sacred and the suffering. Ananda did not hesitate. He removed his outer robe and stepped into the first hut, where a child lay burning with fever. He knelt. He lifted her into his arms and wiped her brow with the cloth, once wrapped across his own shoulders. He offered water, touched hands, listened to breath. He did this not once, but again and again, moving from home to home like the rain itself, gentle, persistent, cleansing. When one monk asked, "Ananda, are you not afraid of impurity?" he replied, "There is no impurity in compassion, only absence." The Buddha, watching from beneath a neem tree, said nothing. But later that night, when the rain began to fall in earnest and the monks wrapped themselves tightly, the Buddha remained uncovered. When Ananda approached with a dry robe, the Buddha said, "Yours has already sheltered many. Let it rest." What makes an act revolutionary is not its volume, but its defiance of indifference. Ananda's compassion was not dramatic. It was wet and cold and inconvenient. It entered spaces others avoided. It bent rules written in ink to honor truths carved in spirit. In many traditions, robes signify status. But Ananda wore his like water wears the earth, freely, without demand. To him, it was not a symbol to be preserved, but a tool to be used, even surrendered. And in doing so, he appended something deeper than ritual. He reminded his fellow practitioners that the Dharma was not in words, but in action, not in form, but in response. There are teachings that instruct the mind, others that soften the heart. Ananda's rain-soaked robe did both. And though his name appears often in the texts, as guardian of memory, as voice of the Sangha, perhaps this story lingers because it reveals the marrow of his path. Not brilliance, but devotion. Not hierarchy, but humility. There is a kind of courage born from clarity. The clarity that compassion is not a feeling, but a choice. To step forward when others step back. To touch what is dying, not with fear, but with love. To let one's robe absorb the suffering of another, not as martyrdom, but as mercy. And what of the villagers? It is said that many recovered, that the rains passed, that the crops, though late, sprouted in time. But what remained most vividly in their stories was not the name of the Buddha, nor the faces of the monks, but the memory of one man who came barefoot into their homes, who sat beside their sick, and who left behind the faint smell of sandalwood and wet cloth. This story, like the rain, is quiet, and like the rain, it seeps in slowly, soaking not just skin but spirit. We live in a world still uncertain about touch, still guarded around pain. But the robe that Ananda gave was not simply fabric. It was the loosening of boundaries, the offering of presence, the statement that no person is too impure, too sick, too far gone to be held. This too is awakening, not sudden, not thunderous, but tender and steady, a kind of revolution carried not in protest, but in the folds of a robe offered in the rain. As the light of day began to soften into the warm hush of evening, casting long golden threads across the stones of the old temple courtyard, a woman knelt at the foot of the staircase. Her hands were weathered, her back slightly bowed, her sari faded by sun and time. But the way she moved, deliberate, quiet, without rush or hesitation, gave the sense that she was not just sweeping dust from stone, but participating in something sacred. Her name was Mira, though few in the monastery knew it. Most simply called her the Sweeper. She had come to the temple many years earlier, not as a nun or devotee, but as a widow with nowhere else to go. The monks had offered her a place to sleep behind the kitchen and a small meal each day. In return, she took up a broom. No one told her to sweep the steps. She simply began. Each morning before the first bell, she would rise, draw water from the well, soak the straw bristles of her broom, and begin her descent from the top of the stairs. Sweep, pause, breathe, sweep again, not with fury, not with hurry, just presence. And each evening, just as the last visitors left, she would sweep once more, this time upward, as if gathering the day's footsteps and returning them to the sky. To some, she was invisible, just another figure in the periphery of a place built for prayer and pilgrimage. But to others, especially those who watched closely, Mira became a teaching in motion. One young novice named Suraj, newly arrived at the temple and struggling with restlessness, began to notice her. At first, it was simple curiosity, how she always seemed calm, how she never missed a stone. But then something deeper began to take root. He found himself pausing in his chores to observe her movements. Her sweeping had a rhythm, almost like chanting. Her breath matched the broom's arc, and though she spoke little, there was something in her silence that softened the sharpness in his own mind. One day, overcome by questions he could no longer hold back, Suraj approached her. "Why do you sweep so carefully? No one is watching." Mira smiled, her eyes kind but not fragile. "The dust comes whether we notice or not," she said. "But when we sweep with attention, we do more than clean. We offer." "Offer what?" he asked. "Gratitude," she replied, "and readiness. We clear the way, for others, for understanding, even for grace." Later, Suraj would reflect on her words and realize that Mira had given him his first true lesson in mindfulness. Not from a sutra, not from a sermon, but from a broom and a quiet hand. In Buddhist teachings, there is a deep reverence for the ordinary, a bowl, a robe, a footstep. These too are vessels of awakening when used with presence. Mira's broom, humble and worn, became such a vessel, and her sweeping was not mere labor. It was a form of metta, loving kindness extended not through speech, but through service. Her work was not noticed in records or recitations. Her name was not inscribed in calligraphy, but the monks began to sense her influence. Their steps became quieter. They removed their shoes more carefully. One even remarked that the stairs felt lighter after she passed. Over time, even pilgrims began to notice. They would slow as they approached the temple, drawn not by the grandeur of statues or the echo of gongs, but by the grace of a woman sweeping. Some began to bow to her without knowing why. Others left small offerings near the base of the stairs. Flowers, fruit, folded notes of thanks. One evening, as the sun sank and a breeze stirred the trees, Mira rested her broom beside her and sat quietly on the lowest step. Her hands lay folded in her lap. Her breath was steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She did not rise again. The monks found her there, smiling faintly, as if the earth itself had paused to breathe with her one last time. The broom rested against her shoulder like a staff made of silence. In the days that followed, the temple was filled not with mourning, but with stillness. No one took up her broom immediately. It was left there untouched for 7 days, as if to honor the space she had swept clear for them all. Eventually, a novice picked it up, not to replace her, but to continue. And so her presence lingered, not in stone or scripture, but in every act of care done without being asked. In every task transformed by attention, in every moment someone remembered that even dust deserves reverence. Revolution does not always wear a robe or speak from a cushion. Sometimes it holds a broom. Sometimes it whispers with each sweep, "This too matters. This too is the path." In the long shadow of late afternoon, when the sun turns the dust to gold and the world begins to exhale the heat of day, there came a moment in a quiet village that would not be written in any scripture, yet it carried the weight of a sutra whispered into the folds of eternity. He was known only as Mara, not the tempter, not the celestial deceiver, but a man of flesh and fatigue, named after the very force the Buddha had once overcome. Some said it was irony, others punishment. He lived beyond the edge of the village, past the last rice field, where the road turned to stone and then to silence. No one knew where he came from, only that he arrived scarred, thin, and with a tremor in his hands that made the children stare and the elders look away. His skin bore the marks of a disease most did not name aloud. Some said it was karma, others contagion. He was not welcomed at the well. The temple gates remained closed when he came near. Even the dogs, trained by cruelty, growled when he passed. He wore rags tied with twine, and his voice, when used, carried the sound of someone who had forgotten what kindness felt like against the skin. And yet, each morning, he bowed to the sun. He had fashioned a small shrine out of river stones and twigs. There he lit incense made of crushed herbs. He knelt on earth hardened by drought. He did not ask for healing. He gave thanks. At the temple in the village center, robes hung in quiet rows, saffron and maroon, like silent flames against whitewashed walls. Among the monks was one named Sela, young, observant, and quick to question, not to rebel, but to understand. One day from the upper balcony, he saw Mara bowing beneath the Bodhi tree outside the gate. Alone, uninvited, Sela watched for weeks, not with suspicion, but with a kind of aching curiosity. How could one so rejected still practice devotion? One evening, he followed Mara after dusk and saw him kneel at his makeshift shrine, chanting softly into the wind. His chant was broken, disjointed, but there was something in it, something sincere. Not performance, not desperation, only presence. The next day, Sela approached the head monk. "Why is that man not allowed inside?" The abbot answered, "He carries sickness and fear. The people will not come if he stays." Sela nodded, but inside, something unsettled began to move. That night, without permission, he took one of the temple robes. Not a new one, but one worn by years of use, softened by prayer. He wrapped it in cloth and left the temple quietly, stepping into the dark where lanterns did not reach. He found Mara beneath the fig tree, shivering in the wind. Sela did not speak. He simply knelt, bowed deeply, and placed the robe before the outcast. Mara looked at it, then at Sela, his eyes searching for mockery. But there was none. Only stillness. Only offering very slowly, as if his bones might crack under the weight of grace. Mara reached out and touched the robe. He held it to his face. He didn't weep, but his breath hitched in the way a breath does when something locked deep inside begins to loosen. He did not wear the robe at first. He carried it. He sat beside it during prayers. He folded it carefully after each use. Only later, after many days, did he drape it across his shoulders, not to pretend, not to claim status, but as a second skin, a sign, perhaps, that he too belonged to something more than exile. The villagers saw him, At first, they whispered, but then something changed, not in him, but in them. Slowly, the well became less guarded. A bowl of rice was left near his shrine. A child, brave in her innocence, offered him a flower. Sela was scolded by the elders. "You risked the community," they said. "You broke rules." He bowed and replied, "I followed the Dharma," and the abbot, though stern, could not hide the softness behind his eyes. In time, Mara was invited to sit beneath the temple portico during full moon gatherings. He never asked for a title. He did not seek robes in rows or a mat in the shrine hall. But he sat with his back straight and his eyes open, wrapped in that worn cloth, breathing alongside the others. The robe, no longer just fabric, had become a thread that mended what had been torn, not just in Mara, but in the community that had once turned away. It was, in its quiet way, a revolution. In Buddhist thought, the robe represents renunciation, discipline, dignity. But in this story, it became something more, an act of inclusion, a gesture that said, your suffering does not make you unworthy, that the Dharma in its truest form has no outer gates, only inner ones. Sometimes, liberation begins not in great teachings or grand rituals, but in the willingness to clothe another with belonging, to drape warmth across shame, to kneel beside what the world has cast out and say without condition, you are still part of this. And that, perhaps, is the essence of compassion, not pity from above, but solidarity from beside, not fear of contagion, but faith in connection. Even the robe, when used with love, becomes a doorway. As the day softened into the warm, dusky hush of early evening, when light hung like a prayer across branches and rooftops, there was a village where people began to speak in whispers around a well, not because they feared it, but because it had begun to speak back. It was an old well, older than anyone living, set in the center of the village, worn smooth by 100,000 hands, its stones moss-lined, its bucket handled by generations. It had quenched thirst, cooled fevered skin, and held the moon's reflection in its still waters longer than memory could trace. But for a time, it had also been a place of division, where caste was observed in silence, where buckets were lowered or withheld depending on who stood at its edge. And then one day, that changed. No miracle, no pronouncement, just a single woman, quiet as dusk, who began to speak kindness into the well. Her name was Padma. She was not a teacher, not a healer, not anyone of title. She sold bundles of herbs and worked with the same hands that drew water. But she had noticed something others had forgotten, that people often muttered fear, blame, or nothing at all when they lowered the bucket. So one day, as she drew water for a tired stranger who had not been greeted by the others, she whispered, "May this water cool what burns in you. May you find rest." She poured it into the man's cup, and he looked at her not with confusion, but with something softer, recognition. The next morning, she did the same for a child with bruises on his arms, then for an elder who always came late to avoid being seen. Each time, she whispered something kind, not loud, not showy, just a seed dropped gently into silence. People began to notice, and not just what she said, but what followed. Those who drank from her bucket lingered a little longer, their shoulders eased. A silence that once held suspicion began to hold something else. Receptivity. Soon, a boy imitated her. He whispered to the rope, "Be strong today." A merchant muttered to the stones, "Thank you for holding us." Even the gruff man, who never spoke above a grunt, was seen placing his hand on the well wall before leaving. It wasn't that the well changed, it was that the way people approached it had. And then came the day of the storm. A traveler soaked, coughing, shivering, stumbled into the village. He was an outsider, unknown, unclean in appearance, speaking with an accent that placed him beyond the river. Most turned away wary, but Padma stepped forward. She offered him a seat, then drew water from the well and handed it to him with both hands. "May this bring you back to yourself," she whispered. He drank slowly, then cried, not from pain, but from the gentleness of being received. Later, when asked why she had helped a stranger, Padma replied, "The water never asks who you are, it only waits to be offered." In Buddhist teaching, there is the concept of samatha, tranquil abiding, a steadiness of presence, like a still pond reflecting the sky. But it is said that even stillness can ripple outward when it holds intention. And what Padma gave to the well was not just water. It was that tranquil offering, repeated over time until the space itself became infused with compassion. Eventually, people began to bring more than buckets. They brought worries. They sat near the well, not just to drink, but to breathe. Arguments faded when voices approached its edge. A man whose father had died sat there for an entire day, saying nothing. When he finally rose, he said simply, "I feel heard." The monks in the nearby temple began to take notice. One visited and said, "The well has become a bodhisattva." Padma laughed softly. "The well was always kind," she said. "We just stopped listening." And perhaps that is the quiet revolution, not to create kindness, but to return to it, to treat every ordinary thing, water, bucket, rope, as sacred, to speak into silence not with authority but with tenderness. Years later, when Padma had grown old and her hands shook when she carried herbs, the well remained unchanged. And yet, it was no longer just a place of water. It had become a place of presence, of soft wishes, of the unspoken understanding that what we give in spirit shapes the spaces we leave behind. No one ever carved her name into the stones. But some say that when the village is still and the last bucket is drawn under a quiet moon, you can still hear her voice in the rising echo from the well's deep center. May you be held, may you be seen, may you remember. Not a sermon, not a rule, just a kindness made into water. As the day slips into its final arc and the light bends low, painting the earth in tones of gold and hush, there comes a stillness that does not beg for answers, but waits quietly for presence. It is in this late, trembling hour of dusk that suffering speaks most clearly, not through screams, but through silence. And it was in such silence that a widow once sat, with a single grain of rice in the palm of her hand. Her name was Shanta. She lived at the edge of a small village pressed between the curve of the river and the shade of distant hills. The villagers remembered her as the woman who used to laugh with her husband under the neem tree, who used to sing while sweeping, whose house always smelled of ginger and jasmine. But after the fever took him, and then months later took her only child, her voice faded. Her body became smaller, but not from age. Grief had folded her into itself like an unfinished letter. She no longer sang, she barely spoke, but each day, she lit incense before a wooden figure of the Buddha her husband had carved and placed a grain of rice in the bowl before it. Just one. Neighbors whispered, "She has nothing left." Some said it was madness, others called it devotion, but no one truly knew what lived behind her eyes. Then came the drought, the river thin to bone. The crops curled in the heat. The temple stores ran low, and the monks walked barefoot from door to door, bowls in hand, receiving fewer and fewer offerings. The whole village began to tighten, words, rations, hopes. Still, each morning, Shanta placed a single grain into the Buddha's bowl and bowed her head. One day, a novice monk came to her door. He had been told not to ask the widow for anything, but hunger does not always listen to reason. His robes were damp with sweat, his eyes sunken. He offered only silence and a lowered gaze. Shanta looked at him, then at the tiny heap of rice she had stored beneath her mat. A remnant of her last meal, barely enough for one. She turned, picked up the single grain she had set aside for the altar, and placed it in the monk's bowl. He hesitated, ashamed, but she met his eyes and said, "Sometimes, we give not because we have much, but because we remember what it means to have nothing." He bowed deeply. Later that day, the story spread. The monk spoke of her offering in hushed tones, not because it was large, but because it was complete. Not symbolic, not convenient, but the very essence of what remained. Buddhist texts often speak of dana, the virtue of giving. But in its purest form, it is not about charity. It is about the unbinding of the self, to give not from surplus, but from the heart's very marrow. Shanta's grain of rice, offered not to gain merit, but to share in suffering, became such a gift. The next morning, she found her doorstep scattered with rice. Just a few grains at first, then more placed anonymously. Someone left a gourd of water, someone else herbs, and a note written in a child's careful script. Your grain fed more than a stomach. It fed our courage. Slowly, she began to sit outside again, not far, just on the step. She spoke a few words to the children who passed. She hummed when sweeping. A neighbor noticed the jasmine scent returning. No miracle restored what she had lost. Her grief remained. But in offering the grain, something shifted. Her sorrow no longer isolated her, it connected her. She became not just the widow, but the one who had remembered how to give in the face of emptiness. And the Buddha's bowl, the wooden one carved long ago, never held more than one grain at a time, but it seemed to shine a little brighter each day, as if the light too understood the sacredness of a humble offering. When we speak of transformation, we often imagine grandeur, lightning, visions, the sudden removal of pain. But sometimes the revolution is smaller than breath. It lives in the moment we choose to extend what little we have, not because we expect reward, but because we recognize our shared hunger. Shanta's grain of rice did not solve the drought. It did not fill bowls or silence every ache, but it reminded the village, and perhaps the world, that compassion is not measured by quantity. It is measured by the willingness to place what remains in another's hands and trust that it is enough. And so, beneath a sky streaked with dusk, as the shadows lengthen and the cool air settles, we remember her, not with statues or songs, but with a grain of rice laid gently in a bowl, and the whisper that follows. This too is a beginning. As the evening deepens and the last light filters through the canopy in threads of soft gold and green, there is a hush beneath the Bodhi tree. A hush not of silence, but of listening. Leaves stir gently, like breath. Roots curl into ancient earth, and high in the branches, barely visible through the rustle of time, hangs a small bell. No one knows exactly how it came to be there. Some say it was placed by a wandering monk long ago, who had sat beneath that very tree to weep the grief he could no longer carry. Others say it was a child who climbed into the limbs and left the bell as an offering for something she could not name, only feel. And some believe it simply appeared one morning, dew kissed and singing softly in the breeze, as if the tree itself had called for it. But however it came, the bell became part of the tree's breath. It did not chime often, only when the wind was just so gentle, insistent, like a whisper brushing the edge of a dream. And when it rang, people would pause, not out of ritual, but reverence. The Bodhi tree, already sacred as the symbol of awakening, now carried this additional stillness, this sound that was not summoned, only received. It became known in the village as the bell that rings for sorrow, not because its tone was mournful, but because something in it opened the heart, gently, like light breaking through the cracks of morning. There was a woman named Tenzima who came each day to sit beneath the tree. She had lost her brother to the sea, her daughter to illness, her voice to grief. She did not speak, but the villagers saw her hands folded around a scrap of fabric and her gaze fixed upward. She never asked the bell to ring. She only waited. And sometimes when her breathing grew soft and the ache in her chest loosened just enough, the wind would rise and the bell would stir. Its sound was not loud, barely more than a thread of silver in the air, but it was enough to bring tears, not of pain, of remembering. In Buddhist practice, The bell is not merely an instrument, it is a call to return to the body, to the moment, to the pulse of the world as it is. Its ringing cuts through the fog of thought, not with command, but invitation. It says, come back to this breath, this life, this grief, this love. Over time, others began to sit beneath the tree. A farmer whose son had left for the city and never returned. A widow who wore her sorrow like a shawl of quiet. A monk who had lost his faith in words and now sought refuge in sound. They did not come to speak, they came to hear, to feel the bell's soft resonance remind them that their sorrow did not need to be solved, only witnessed. And in that witnessing, healing began, not quickly, not completely, but steadily, like roots finding water beneath dry soil. Children began tying small ribbons to the lower branches, wishes, names, prayers not for change but for peace. The bell never asked for these offerings, but it held them, nonetheless, in its patient silence. The villagers came to understand that the bell would not ring on command. It was not there to perform. It rang when the moment was ready, when the stillness had been honored, when the sorrow had softened just enough to let sound pass through. One elder remarked, "It is the voice of what we carry when we stop trying to carry it alone." And so the bell became a teacher, not of doctrine, but a space. It taught the value of waiting, of quiet, of not rushing the return from sorrow to joy. It showed that awakening does not always rise like fire. Sometimes it drips like dew from a leaf falling unnoticed, yet utterly complete. Tenzima, in time, found her voice again, not in speech but in song. She began humming as she walked through the village, and children followed her, drawn not by melody, but by the softness in her presence. She still visited the tree, still waited. But now, when the bell rang, she smiled. It is said that on some nights, long after the sun has gone and the stars have taken their places, the bell continues to ring, not with wind, but with memory. That it holds the sound of all who have sat beneath it, each note woven with breath, with sorrow, with release. The Bodhi tree remains, and the bell still hangs, and even when it is silent, something in its stillness hums, gently, reverently, a reminder that even in grief, there is music. Even in shadow, there is light waiting to return. Sometimes a bell is not just a bell. It is the voice of compassion, suspended between heaven and earth. Just before dusk, when the shadows of the mountains lengthen into quiet fingers, and the wind begins to move with a kind of memory, a man stood alone on a desert path, kneeling beside a broken cartwheel. The sun, low and unblinking, cast the dust in warm gold, and the silence around him was complete, except for the sound of his own breath, uneven and taut. His name was Raji, a merchant once known for his precision. He measured his life in numbers and weight. How many bolts of silk? How many steps from village to village? How many coins in his pouch? How many hours until arrival? He did not pray. He did not pause. Time to him was a matter of profit. Movement meant success. Stillness was a cost. Until the wheel broke. It splintered on a jagged stone, miles from the nearest shelter, just as night began to settle in. He cursed at first, then shouted into the emptiness. No one answered. There was no help to summon, no path to retrace. Just the fractured wood, the unmoving cart, and the realization that he would not arrive where he intended, at least not on time, and perhaps not at all. He sat. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. The desert cooled. The silence deepened, and in that stillness, a strange thing began to happen. The rage drained from his body. The urgency unraveled. What remained was not despair, but something else, something quieter. He looked at the wheel, its broken spoke, its jagged edge. A thing once perfect in its function, now utterly still, useless by his usual measure. But it sat there without complaint, and as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Raji began to wonder what if the wheel, in its breaking, was not failing, but teaching. There's an old Zen koan that asks, when the cart stops and the wheel breaks, Where does the journey continue? It is not a riddle to be solved. It is an invitation to presence. For the first time in years, Roger was forced to be still, not by choice, but by circumstance. And yet, it was within this immobility that something in him began to move. Thoughts he had long outrun returned. Memories of his mother's gentle voice, of his child's laughter, of promises made and left behind in the rush towards something called success. He began to breathe differently. Not in anticipation, but in awareness. Somewhere in the night, he began to hum, a tune without words, one he hadn't remembered until it came unbidden. It came from a deeper place, not from memory, but from essence. By morning, the desert shimmered with light, and Raji had not fixed the wheel. He had not moved. But he was no longer waiting, he was resting. And in that rest, something inside him had mended. When a wandering monk came upon him and asked if he needed help, Raji smiled. "No," he said, "not in the way I thought." He did not abandon the cart. He repaired the wheel slowly, not to resume the journey, but to honor it. And when he walked into the next village, days later, barefoot and dusty, he carried no goods, no cargo, only a story of a wheel that broke and of the silence that followed. In Buddhism, the wheel is a sacred symbol, the Dharma chakra, the wheel of the law. It represents movement, continuity, the path of truth. But sometimes the wheel must stop. Sometimes what carries us forward must fall apart so that we may finally look around or inward. Suffering often arrives like that broken wheel, abrupt, uninvited, shattering the momentum we mistook for meaning. We rage, we resist, we grasp at solutions, but eventually we sit, and it is in that sitting, beneath the vast sky of uncertainty, that a deeper truth begins to emerge, that stillness is not failure. It is the beginning of wisdom. Raji continued to walk for many years, but he never again measured a journey by distance. He spoke little, but when asked what changed him, he would sometimes pause and say, "The wheel broke." I listened, and that became the heart of his teaching, not taught from a cushion, but lived on the road that sometimes it is only in the breaking that we remember we are whole. The path from suffering to light is not always paved. Sometimes it is dust. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is the space between what we expected and what is. And in that space, if we are quiet enough, we may hear the truth ring out, like the echo of a cone, whispered by the wind across a broken wheel. As night draws near and the last light folds itself gently over the ridges of the hills, there is a moment when everything softens, where outlines blur and what is broken begins to glow. This is not the glow of brilliance or spectacle, but of warmth carried quietly from within. In such an hour, the story of a child named Nima lives on, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a meditation on the strange alchemy of pain and tenderness. Nima was born in the northern highlands, where wind carves its wisdom into stone and silence lives like an elder in the corners of every home. He was a quiet boy, one of those children who seemed to notice things others missed, the way frost curled at the edge of leaves, how shadows moved like breath at twilight, how birds fell silent when a storm was near. His mother said he was born with his heart turned outward. His father, a weaver, said little, but once held Nima's small hand and whispered, "You feel more than most. That is your strength and your sorrow." When Nima was 7, a cooking fire spread from the hearth and caught the side of the house. His mother rushed to save him, and in doing so, shielded his body from the worst of the flame, but not entirely. A portion of his back and shoulder was burned. The pain was searing, and when the wounds healed, they left behind a ridged, spiraled scar like a tree branch twisted by wind. The villagers, though kind, could not help but stare. Children whispered, adults offered pity, and slowly Nima withdrew. He stopped playing in the field. He stopped lifting his shirt when the days grew warm. He began to walk with a slouch, as if he could fold his body around the place where the skin had changed. One afternoon, a traveling monk visited the village. He carried no staff, no bundle, only a singing bowl and a bell wrapped in cloth. He spoke very little, but he offered to teach meditation beneath the fig tree near the river, and some villagers gathered out of curiosity, others out of politeness. Nima stood at a distance, hidden by the tall grass. After a while, the monk spoke. "We all carry marks," he said, "some seen, some not. Some shaped like grief, others shaped like blame, silence, or memory, but all of them speak. The question is, can we learn to listen?" That night, Nima returned to the tree alone. He waited in silence. The monk returned without being called. He sat beside the boy, not facing him, just sharing the hush of stars. "Does it hurt?" the monk asked gently. "Not anymore," Nima whispered. "Then what does it say?" Nima didn't answer at first. Then he said, "It says I was saved, but I also feel wrong." The monk nodded slowly. "Scars are strange," he said. "They are reminders of what we've endured, yes, but also of how we were held." Touch changed. The next evening, the monk asked Nima to sit with him again. This time, he brought his bell. It was old, rimmed in bronze and pocked by age. "This bell is cracked," he said, "but listen." He struck it gently, and the sound that rose from it was unlike anything the boy had ever heard. Not sharp, not perfect, but deep, round, warm, like the echo of kindness held in a vessel that had learned how to break. The crack changed the sound, the monk said, "not for worse, just more true." He looked at Nima. "You are like this bell." From that night on, Nima began to shift, not all at once, not with confidence, but with presence. He began sitting with the monk beneath the fig tree. He began walking upright again. When he swam in the river, he no longer turned away. His scar, still there, still vivid, began to feel less like a burden and more like a story. And something even stranger happened. On certain nights, when the light was just right and his skin caught the last breath of the setting sun, his scar seemed to shimmer, not brightly, but enough that it glowed. The villagers began to notice, not with pity, but awe. Some began to bring their own stories to Nima, quiet confessions of losses, of regrets, of places in themselves that had never quite healed. And Nima, still a child, did not offer answers. He simply listened. His presence became a balm, not because he had overcome his suffering, but because he had allowed it to teach him how to stay. In Buddhist teachings, there is no promise that suffering will disappear, but there is the possibility that through it, we may find our way back to light, not by erasing what hurt us, but by honoring how it shaped us. That even scars, when held with tenderness, can shine. Nima grew. The monk eventually left, as monks do. But the bell remained, and Nima kept it by the tree, where he would sit and wait, not for answers, but for anyone who needed to be seen. And when he struck the bell, it rang with that same depth, that same truth, a sound shaped by imperfection, a sound that held both wound and wonder. And his scar, now weathered with time, continued to glow, not as a mark of pain, but as a testament to how light returns. At the hour just before nightfall, when the sky wears a gentle hush and the earth exhales the warmth of the day, there is a small garden on the edge of a once war-torn village. It is not marked on maps, nor announced with signs. It grows behind a low wooden fence, simple and weathered, in soil that remembers both ash and prayer. This is the garden of empty shoes. It began not with intention, but with loss. There was once a teacher named Kamala who lived in the village before the war came. She taught letters, but more than that, she taught kindness. She believed that every child had a light inside them, some fierce like fire, others soft like moonlight, but all worthy of tending. Her classroom was open air, its floor swept daily with palm fronds, its roof shared by sparrows, and every morning, the children would line up outside, remove their shoes, and place them in neat rows along the bamboo railing before sitting cross-legged to learn. When the war arrived, It did not knock. It swallowed everything in smoke and silence. Kamala's school was the first to close. The children scattered. Some were taken, some vanished. Some returned changed. When the guns quieted and the dust began to settle, Kamala returned to the spot where the classroom had once stood. The bamboo was gone, the sparrows too. But in a corner of the field, half buried in soot, darkened, she found a single child's sandal, its strap broken, its heel still marked by a small, worn impression. She did not cry. She held the shoe to her chest, sat down in the dirt, and whispered a child's name into the wind. The next day, she cleared a patch of earth where the children had once gathered. She laid the shoe there gently, like a seed. Then she planted marigolds around it. Bright, resilient things. She watered them. She waited. Over time, she found more shoes, some tangled in fence wire, some in the rubble of homes, some left behind by families who had fled. Each one was different. Small canvas slippers, worn sandals, a leather boot with fraying laces. Each one held a story, though no lips remained to tell it. She did not try to match them. She simply cleaned them, arranged them, and planted around them. Tulsi, hibiscus, jasmine, basil. She whispered names she remembered. For those she didn't, she offered silence. People began to notice. At first, they avoided the place. It felt too heavy, too strange. But the flowers grew, and the shoes, instead of haunting, seemed to speak softly, not of terror, but of tenderness, as if the garden were not a monument to death, but a sanctuary for memory. One morning, an old man brought a child's shoe he had found hidden in the rafters of his home. He wept as he placed it near the hibiscus. Then he knelt and stayed there for a long time, his hand resting on the soft earth. A mother came days later with a pair of shoes too small for her growing son. She said, "He came back, but not all of him." She left them as an offering, not for what was lost, but for what had been spared. Soon the garden filled, not with answers, but with presence. Monks visited and lit incense. Children came and planted wildflowers. A boy once left behind a note inside a shoe. May no one else be forgotten. In Buddhism, we speak of dukkha, the suffering inherent in life. But there is also sankhara, the truth that all things are shaped by cause and condition. The garden did not arise from joy, but from sorrow. Yet what it became was not darkness, but transformation. To see the shoes is to feel the ache of absence. But to see them among blossoms, nestled in green and bloom, is to know that loss does not erase love. It only changes its shape, from footsteps to stillness, from voice to wind, from presence to memory held gently in soil and petals. Kamala never rebuilt the classroom. Instead, she returned to the garden each morning with a watering can and a quiet heart. Sometimes she sang, but most days she simply listened, to the breeze, to the bees, to the echo of laughter long past but never quite gone. She aged as all things do, but the garden remained, and each dusk, as shadows lengthened and soft light pooled over the shoes, the garden seemed to hum, not with grief, but with grace. A reminder that in the space between suffering and light, there can grow a beauty rooted in remembrance. That even the smallest things, a single shoe, a single bloom, can carry the weight of love and the light of healing. At the blue edge of dawn, where light is neither night nor day but something in between, an old man stood on the shore with his last fishing net in hand. His name was Somchai, and for most of his life, he had risen before the birds to cast his net into the wide, silver mouth of the sea. Not for wealth, he caught only what was needed, but out of rhythm. The sea was his temple, the net his prayer. He lived in a stilted hut just above the tide line, built by his grandfather, repaired by his father, and weathered by storms that had come and gone without ceremony. The sea had given him fish, yes, but also silence, pattern, forgiveness. On the hardest days, he would speak to it, not with the desperation of begging, but with the familiarity of one who knows the waves will always return, even if the fish do not. In his youth, Somchai had been strong. His net, woven by hand, was an extension of his body. But now his hands trembled slightly. His breath came shallower. He felt in the deep part of himself that this would be the final morning. Not the final one for his life, perhaps, but the last time his body would carry him from the hut to the shore. The last time his arms would be strong enough to cast wide into the surf. So he stood quietly, feeling the sand cool beneath his feet, the smell of salt curling into the air like incense, and he whispered, "Thank you." It was not meant to be dramatic, just a closing bow. Then he cast the net. It did not stretch as far as it once had. The arc was slower, the pull more reluctant, but it landed, and the sea accepted it. He waited. Minutes passed. The waves breathed against his knees. The net moved slightly, then stilled. He pulled it in, slow and steady. No fish, only seaweed, tangled and glistening, and one small, round stone nestled in the weave. A stone smooth as bone, pale as moonlight, shaped like an eye half closed in meditation. He turned it over in his palm and smiled. Long ago, when he was a boy, Somchai's mother had told him a story of a fisherman in another life who cast his net not to catch, but to return. He once fished in anger, she said, took too much, left nothing behind. And so in this life he came back, not to take but to balance the ocean ledger, to offer stillness, to practice the art of enough. At the time he thought it was just a tale, but now standing there he wondered, how many lives had it taken to learn restraint, to fish with reverence, not hunger, to cast not from greed but from grace? He did not know, but the answer didn't matter. He placed the stone in a small bowl in his hut, not as a treasure but as a reminder. Then he walked back down to the beach, not to fish but to sit and watch. That evening, a young boy from the village approached him, barefoot, curious, clutching a makeshift net of twine and bamboo. He asked if Somchai would teach him. The old man nodded and said, "I will teach you how to fish. But more than that, I will teach you when not to." So each morning after they met at the shore, they spoke little. The boy learned the knots, the casts, the tides. He learned the language of silence, the ethics of enough. And over time, he learned to return what he did not need. Somchai never told him why. He simply showed him the rhythm. And then, one morning, Somchai did not appear. The boy found the hut empty, the bowl with the stones still on the table. Nothing else was taken. No farewell was written. Only a faint scent of sea wind and old jasmine. Some say he walked into the tide, as some elders do, offering his last breath to the ocean that had cradled his life. Others say he simply lay down to rest and dissolved into memory. But the boy, now older, returned each morning, casting his net, not with expectation but with care. And on the days he caught nothing, he sat and watched the sea, just as Somchai had done. In Buddhist thought, the wheel of samsara turns lifetime after lifetime, patterns repeating until clarity breaks through. Somchai's net was once cast in craving, then in humility, and finally, in devotion. His final net caught no fish, but it caught a teaching. Not every act leaves a mark. Some leave a rhythm, and so the sea continues to breathe. The nets rise and fall. The boy, now a man, tells his children of the old fisherman who gave more than he ever took, who cast his final net, not into water, but into time itself. And still, on the blue edge of dawn, if the wind is quiet, you might hear it, the whisper of a net slipping gently into the sea, and the prayer of a life complete. Long ago, in a kingdom where silk shimmered like starlight, and the scent of jasmine clung to the air long after nightfall, there lived a prince whose voice had never been heard. From the moment he was born, wrapped in robes of deep saffron and offered to the palace gods, he remained silent, not from affliction, but from choice. The court healers examined him. The scholars debated. His parents, a king of great lineage and a queen of rare wisdom, pleaded gently, but the boy would only smile, sometimes tilt his head and offer his gaze as answer. a gaze as clear as a mountain lake and just as deep. They named him Sudeva, which means of gentle divinity, and though he would not speak, he seemed to understand all things spoken to him, perhaps more than those who spoke them. At first, the kingdom was unsettled. What is a prince who does not proclaim, who does not issue decree, nor boast, nor argue? But in time, people noticed something else. The animals came near to him. Birds would land on the edge of his robes. Even the palace dogs, once brash and territorial, became calm in his presence, their tails low, their breath soft, and the sick who were brought to him, children with fevers, elders in pain, would often grow quiet too, as if resting in his stillness. By the time he reached 17, Sudeva had never once spoken aloud, but his presence spoke with great force. Ministers who came to manipulate power found themselves unmoored before him. Their arguments unraveled mid-sentence. The courtiers called it the mirror effect, because in Sudeva's silence, people often heard their own noise more clearly. The prince would walk alone in the gardens each morning, bare feet brushing dew from the grass, hands behind his back. It was there, under a fig tree, that an old monk once approached and asked him directly, "Why do you not speak, child of gold and blood?" Sudeva looked at the monk for a long while, then plucked a fallen blossom from the grass. He placed it in the monk's palm and bowed. The monk smiled. "Ah," he whispered, "you speak the language of the middle path." As the years passed, the king grew weary. Age crept into his bones like wind through worn stone. He summoned his son and said, "The throne must pass. The world is noisy. It needs a ruler who can shout louder than its chaos." Sudeva knelt before his father and placed a hand on his own throat. Then he tapped gently on his heart. Finally, he opened his palm as though releasing something invisible to the air. The king stared at his son's gesture. He understood, barely. That night, as moonlight fell in soft silver across the court, the king called the advisors. He said, "My son shall not rule from the throne, but from the silence beneath it." And so it was. Sudeva became known not as king, but as the still regent. He sat behind a veil in the hall of assembly. His presence remained constant at every council, every judgment. He never overruled, but his silence became a compass. When debates turned heated or voices rose, those present would glance toward the veil and pause. They would ask themselves, would I speak these words if I heard them in silence first? Slowly, the kingdom began to shift. Petty grievances fell away. Decrees shortened. The ministers spoke with greater care, and those who sought approval found they had to find clarity first within themselves. Children were told, "Speak as though the prince listens," and this became not a warning, but a guide. Years passed, and still the prince remained silent. But it was said he wrote poetry in the sand with a stick each morning at dawn, and when the winds erased it, he never mourned the loss. He simply wrote again. His only utterance was in the gestures of grace, the placement of hands, the way his eyes met the world. One day, a great famine approached. The skies withheld rain, crops failed. Panic rose. People called for louder voices, stronger commands. But Sudeva did not answer in speech. He walked barefoot across the kingdom, village to village, with his empty bowl in hand. At first, people were confused. Was the prince begging? But slowly, as they saw his path, they understood he was asking not for himself, but for one another. Wherever he went, people shared what they could. One grain here, one root there. He said nothing, but his bowl filled and emptied again in offerings to the sick, the children, the old. The rains returned weeks later. Whether by prayer chants or alignment of cause and condition, no one knew. But the people remembered the silence that moved through them like wind through bamboo. Quiet, unseen, and completely transformative. Sudeva grew older. His silence deepened like a well that touches bedrock. And on the night he died, there was no grand ceremony. Only a single blossom left by the fig tree, and a village child, mute by birth, who came and sat beside it in perfect stillness. It is said that the boy's first word came weeks later, not out of need but offering. "Peace," he whispered, as if speaking it to the wind. In the Buddhist way, silence is not an absence. It is a fullness, a field where compassion blooms beyond thought, where words fall away and only wisdom remains. Sudeva's story echoes across lifetimes, not because he ruled, but because he listened. Not because he shouted above others, but because he bowed beneath the noise and made space for truth to rise. Even now, in that kingdom long faded into history, travelers speak of the prince who chose silence, and of a garden where blossoms fall gently into the earth, carrying messages no language can contain. At the tender edge of morning, when the world still dreams in mist and the trees hold the breath of night, a small sparrow landed on the windowsill of a village temple. Its feathers were dusted in the gold of early light, its wings thin from long travel, but its gaze, dark and bright, carried a knowing that seemed older than the sky itself. The old monk who swept the temple floor each morning paused mid-motion, his broom frozen in the hush. He had seen many sparrows in his life. They nested in the rafters, stole rice from the offering bowls, fluttered through the courtyard like the laughter of the wind. But this one was different. It did not flutter. It did not startle. It simply looked at him, tilted its head, and blinked once slowly, as if greeting a memory. The monk bowed to the bird. Then, almost without thinking, he whispered, "Welcome back." No one else heard him. The temple had few visitors in these later years, and fewer still who believed in such things. But the monk had lived long enough to trust in circles more than lines. He believed that lives returned, not always as they had been, but in the shape of echoes, gestures, glances that moved like ripples across the fabric of time. And once, many years before, he had known a child named Kavi. Kavi was not born to the temple, but he came to it when he was no more than 6, skinny, quiet, eyes like soft ink. He had lost his family in a storm that swept through the coastal region, leaving behind broken boats and driftwood shrines. A merchant brought him north and left him with the monks, saying, "He has nowhere else." Kavi said little, but he swept the floors diligently, tended the incense with care, and often sat near the bell tower during meditation. Not to join in chanting, but to listen. He had a gentleness that did not ask to be seen. But the monk noticed. One day the monk found him near the garden, carefully feeding crumbs to a sparrow with a bent wing. The bird flinched from others, but not from Kavi. He held his hand flat and still, eyes soft, voice quiet. "She trusts me," he said. The monk watched for many days. Kavi's compassion was not loud or performative. It was woven into his being, like the grain of the wood in the offering table, like the hush of the candle flame before prayer. But the boy did not stay. One spring, he fell ill, an illness that came fast and deep, like rain that does not announce itself. The monks cared for him, but his body, small and already marked by hardship, could not hold. He died at dusk, just as the last bell rang. The monk wept that night, not with noise, but with breathless silence. He lit a lantern and whispered a single promise into the dark: return in peace. Now, decades later, a sparrow sat before him with eyes like soft ink. He moved slowly, gently crumbling a bit of rice cake in his palm and holding it toward the bird. It hopped closer, pecked, then stayed. That day, and for many after, the sparrow returned. It did not speak, of course not, but in its stillness, the monk remembered the stillness of the boy. In its gaze, the gentleness. In its return, a vow kept. In Buddhist teaching, there is the idea of paticassamuppada, dependent origination, that all things arise due to causes and conditions, interconnected and ever unfolding. The monk had studied this, chanted its verses, and now, here on the windowsill, he saw it in feathered form, not proof, not doctrine, but intimacy. The kind that sings softly in the cracks of a broken world. the villagers began to notice. The temple sparrow, they called it. Some believed it brought good fortune. Others simply liked to see it perch atop the bell tower, as if keeping time with the passing of days. But for the monk, it was something else entirely. It was grace, quiet, unannounced, unbound by time. On the anniversary of Kavi's passing, the monk prepared a small bowl of water, a sprig of jasmine, and a bit of rice, placing it near the old altar. The sparrow came, not with fanfare, but with the ease of belonging. He bowed low. "Thank you for returning," he whispered. That night, a gentle wind passed through the temple halls. The candles flickered, and the monk dreamed not of grand teachings or visions of Buddha, but of a boy sitting in sunlight, feeding a bird with a bent wing, smiling with the calm of one who had made peace. When the monk passed not long after, the villagers said he died with a smile on his lips. The sparrow vanished for some time. Then, years later, another child came to the temple, quiet, gentle, and with an uncanny fondness for birds. So the rhythm continues, not through monuments, but through soft returns, through the flutter of wings, through acts of unseen kindness, through silence that carries memory like a seed through wind. For in the great turning of lives, even the smallest among us can return to bring healing, again and again, until all things are made whole. High in the northern mountains, where pine trees hold the snow like secrets, and the clouds drift low enough to brush the rooftops, there is a temple that sits on the shoulder of a cliff, half stone, half silence. Travelers call it the Mirror Temple, not for its walls or relics, but for the single object held in its heart, a round mirror, no wider than a lotus leaf, said to be over 1,000 years old. The monks who live there do not speak of miracles. They sweep the paths and tend to the wood stoves, offering tea to the rare guests who climb the steep trail. But they all speak, eventually, of the mirror. It is not made of silver. It does not gleam. If you pass by it too quickly, you may mistake it for an old burnished plate. And yet, those who have sat before it, truly sat, report strange things, not visions or ghosts, but memories, echoes. Some say the mirror shows not your face, but yourself, shaped across lifetimes. The current abbot, a soft-spoken man named Tenzin, arrived many years ago as a young seeker burdened with rage. He had not come for enlightenment, nor beauty, nor peace. He had come to forget, to bury a grief so large it had begun to hollow his body from the inside. A war had taken from him everything: his family, his home, his belief in anything whole. On his second day at the temple, a monk gestured toward the inner chamber and said simply, "Sit with it." Tenzin did not understand, but he was too tired to argue. So he entered the chamber and sat cross-legged before the mirror. At first, he saw only his own face, gaunt and tense. Then the flickering of candlelight. Then nothing at all, just a blur, as if the mirror refused to reflect him. He scoffed and turned away, but something tugged at him. That night and the nights after, he returned. Each time he sat longer, and each time the reflection changed, not dramatically, but subtly. A child's face once surfaced, eyes wide with kindness. Another night, an old woman's mouth curved in forgiveness. Then a soldier with sorrow in his brow. Then a man with no eyes, but a smile as serene as the moon. One evening, after weeks of sitting, Tenzin saw himself not as he was, but as he had been, not just from this life, but from others. In the mirror, he saw a woodcutter laying down his axe and bowing before a tree he had wounded. He saw a beggar placing his only coin into the hand of a dying stranger. He saw a woman, himself in another form, standing in the rain with arms outstretched, offering her body as a shield to a mother and child. And then, finally, he saw himself as he was, weeping. Not out of despair, but recognition. The mirror had not shown him who he wished to be. It had shown him the pattern of who he had been. Threads of compassion woven into lives marked by suffering, shaped again and again by choice. He left the chamber that night, and did not speak of what he saw for a long time. But from that day forward, his hands changed. They no longer shook with anger. They offered tea with steadiness. They healed wounds with simple herbs. He became still, not because he had been silenced, but because he had remembered his voice. Now, when seekers come, he does not explain the mirror. He simply invites them to sit. And still it reflects. A young mother once saw the face of a girl she had forgotten. A friend lost in childhood whose kindness she had never repaid. A merchant saw himself as a thief in another life, stealing not out of malice but hunger, and wept for the first time since his own son died. An old monk once sat before it and laughed. "I have been all of them," he said, "the hero, the fool, the saint, the liar. And yet here I am, just a man sweeping snow." In Buddhist thought, we often speak of Anatman, the not-self, that we are not fixed beings but shifting aggregates. The mirror does not contradict this. Rather, it reveals how fluid our becoming truly is, how every gesture, every choice leaves a fingerprint, not on the glass, but on the soul's unfolding. The mirror temple still stands, pilgrims still climb, snow still falls quietly, and inside, in a room where no one speaks above a whisper, a simple mirror waits, not to judge, not to praise, but to reflect the truth that healing is remembering who we already are beneath all the forgetting. Sometimes the journey to compassion is not a path forward, but a turning inward until we see our lives in full. The cycles, the echoes, the fragile beauty of trying again. And in that reflection, not of perfection but of persistent love, we begin to forgive even the darkest corners of ourselves. There is a story passed quietly from teacher to student, across centuries and rivers of ink, that speaks of a single alms bowl, simple black lacquered, unadorned, that has journeyed further than any pilgrim. Not because of its craftsmanship or the metal that rims its lip, but because of the hands that have held it, the hearts that have filled it, and the stars it has passed beneath. The tale begins not in any one place, but many, in one life. The bowl belonged to a monk who wandered through the misty hills of northern India, wrapped in robes frayed by wind and time. He was nameless to most, known only by the soft echo of his presence. Each morning he held the bowl out with both hands, not demanding, not expecting, offering the world a chance to give. Some days it was filled with fragrant rice and mango slices, other days only a splash of cool water. But always the monk bowed in gratitude, as though receiving a gift beyond value. When he died, the bowl passed quietly to his disciple, who treated it as one would a relic, not because it held power, but because it held memory. And so began its long journey, across generations, through temples and caves, past cities that rose and crumbled into dust. In another age, the bowl surfaced in Tibet, carried by a nun who traveled alone, chanting the Prajnaparamita beneath her breath. It is said she kept nothing else. No scrolls, no possessions, only that bowl and a folded cloth. She never begged. She simply sat in meditation at crossroads. People left offerings, and she used whatever came to feed the sick and poor. When asked why she did not eat first, she replied, "Because I am already full." Her name, too, faded, but the bowl endured. Later, it was found in a monastery struck by famine. The abbot, rather than keeping the last stores for the monks, filled the bowl with the final handful of grain and left it at the gate for the villagers. Each night, someone would take a portion. Each morning, more grain would appear. The villagers believed it was a miracle, but the monks said nothing. They simply continued filling it, one handful at a time. Centuries passed, empires fell, dust gathered and was swept away. The bowl was lost, then found, then lost again. But wherever it surfaced, something softened. A merchant who once stole it from a stupa claimed later that it burned cold in his hands until he returned it. A soldier during wartime who stumbled upon it in a ruined shrine left his weapon at its base and walked away into the mountains, never to be seen again. The bowl asked for nothing, it offered nothing, and yet it transformed. Why? Because in Buddhist thought, the alms bowl is not merely a vessel for food. It is a symbol of emptiness made sacred. It represents the open heart, the receptive spirit, the readiness to meet the world not with conquest, but with humility. To hold the bowl is to say, I trust the universe enough to ask, and I honor it enough to receive with reverence. Even today, some say the bowl still moves, quietly, across the world. Not on display in any museum, not enshrined in glass, but passed hand to hand when the moment is right, when someone is ready to carry more than just sustenance, but the burden and grace of compassion. Perhaps it has taken new forms. Perhaps it is no longer made of lacquer, but of clay, or tin, or the cupped palms of someone kneeling to tend a stranger's wound. Perhaps it lives now in every gesture of offering. The cup of tea placed gently beside a hospital bed, the folded blanket left on a doorstep, the warm bread broken in silence between two souls who once called each other enemy. The stars under which the bowl first passed still shine. They shine over us now, just as they did over that nameless monk long ago. And beneath those stars, each of us holds a bowl, whether we know it or not. The shape of it is not important. What matters is how we offer it, what we place in it, and how we carry it when it feels unbearably light or impossibly heavy. This story is not about a relic. It is about remembering that the most enduring things are often the most ordinary when used with love. And so the bowl continues, not to be filled, but to fill others, not to be possessed, but to be passed, not to be seen, but to be felt in every small act of care, offered without fanfare, and carried like starlight through the long night of human forgetting. In a quiet valley rimmed by forest and folded sky, there once walked a monk who said very little and was known by even less. His name, if he had one, was not recorded, nor was his lineage, his teacher, or the precise path he followed. But those who lived along the stone paths and dirt roads that curved through the valley came to know him as the stillness that walks. He arrived without ceremony, no trumpet of incense, no scroll of teachings, no following of pilgrims, only a staff of wood, sandaled feet, and robes the color of dusk. At sunrise, he would be seen passing through the mist, his pace neither hurried nor idle. At noon, he sat beneath banyan or pine, his eyes lowered not in shame, but humility. And by evening, he was gone again, leaving behind no possessions, only the slight impression in the grass where he had rested. Children, as children do, were the first to notice. He walks like the wind is inside him, one boy whispered. He listens to trees, said another, and though the elders dismissed it at first, they too began to feel something shift when he passed. Birds stilled, the air held its breath. Even the dogs, who barked at carts and strangers, simply watched him go, their tails swaying gently like grass in reverence. One day an old farmer caught up to him just before dusk. He had watched the monk pass his field for months and could no longer hold his curiosity. "Where are you going?" he asked. The monk turned, his face lined like bark. "Soft with time. I do not know," he said. "Then why walk?" The monk smiled, a gesture quieter than sunlight on still water. "Because each step listens." It was a strange answer, but somehow it settled into the farmer's chest and stayed there long after the monk had disappeared into the trees. Many assumed he was a sage. Others believed he was lost, but those who paid closer attention noticed something more subtle, an energy that lingered after him. A woman who had suffered unbearable grief found herself weeping beside the trail he had walked, and felt somehow as though her tears had been seen. A merchant weighed down by guilt for an old betrayal sat near a place the monk had meditated and finally forgave himself. No words were exchanged, no rituals performed, just stillness left behind like dew, and perhaps that was the teaching. In our world so heavy with noise and movement, Stillness is often mistaken for absence, but true stillness, the kind carried like a seed through generations, is not hollow. It is presence without effort. It is attention without grasping. It is compassion without performance. In Zen, there is a saying, "Walk as if your feet are kissing the earth." The monk seemed to walk in this way, not pushing against the world, but touching it gently, inviting it to remember its softness. He was not preaching renunciation, nor modeling perfection. He made mistakes. Once, a farmer caught him stumbling on a rocky path and offered to help. The monk laughed. "Stillness," he said, rubbing his bruised shin, "is not the same as balance." Another time, a child gave him a flower, and he burst into tears so freely it startled even the village priest. When asked why, he replied only, "Because it remembered me." It was not that he was different from others. It was that he carried no armor, no shield of cleverness, no performance of certainty. He moved through the world as it was, not as he wished it to be, and in doing so he gave permission for others to do the same. He stayed in the valley for 7 years. Then, one spring, he simply stopped appearing. His path faded. His footsteps were no longer found in the soft morning earth. Some said he had reached enlightenment. Others believed he had returned to the mountains, or perhaps crossed into death, like someone gently stepping from one room into the next. But a curious thing happened in his absence. People began walking differently. They slowed. They noticed the wind moving through bamboo. They paused before speaking. They listened when others wept. The baker set aside extra bread each morning for the poor, and said it was because the monk once nodded at my oven. The teacher began ending her lessons with silence instead of instruction. A boy stopped throwing stones at birds. A girl began leaving bowls of water beneath trees for stray animals. No one told them to do this. The change was not dramatic, but it was deep, like a spring swelling beneath dry ground. It is said that long after the monk was gone, someone placed a stone marker along his favorite path. It had no name, no dates, only a single phrase etched in weather-worn script: "Stillness walks here." And perhaps this is what it means to embody the living Dharma, not to teach with words or texts alone, but to become the very rhythm of compassion, to walk not for destination, but for presence, to carry stillness not as an escape, but as an offering, a listening heart that moves. In that way, the monk was not special. He was simply a mirror. He showed us what we are when we remember to be quiet enough to feel the world breathe. And even now, when someone walks with deep attention, when their steps are light, their eyes soft, their silence full, you might hear it whispered in the rustle of leaves, or the hush of early snow. Stillness walks again. Under the vast canopy of the Bodhi tree, where myth and memory meet in the filtered green of ancient leaves, there came a sound unexpected. Laughter, not sharp or mocking, not loud or demanding, just a soft, uncontainable ripple of joy, like a stone skipping across still water. It came from a monk named Sopa, who had arrived at the monastery not with a vow of silence or the gravity of a scholar, but with pockets full of small pebbles and stories that made even the sternest monks sigh with reluctant smiles. Sopa was round in form and light in step, with eyes that seemed to carry the whole sky in them, and a mouth always a few seconds from breaking into amusement. He was the kind of person others mistook for simple. He tended the gardens and the goats. He spoke plainly and often sang to himself when sweeping the leaves from the temple steps. But those who spent time with him found their hearts loosen. Their burdens, which they'd worn like stiff robes, began to slip quietly to the ground. It wasn't just the laughter, it was how he laughed, as if the universe had just told him a secret, one that wasn't cruel or cynical, but perfectly, hilariously true. Once, a young novice, newly shaved and swollen with pride, approached Sopa with a question meant to test him. "Master Sopa, what is the sound of one hand clapping?" Sopa tilted his head. tapped his chest, and without missing a beat, clapped once with his heart. Then, pointing to the leaves overhead, said, "Ask the tree. It's been listening longer than either of us." Then he laughed, not at the novice but with him, inviting him into the mystery. That was the thing about Sopa's laughter. It never excluded, it never mocked, it never separated. It was a laughter that gathered all things close. The broken sandals, the cracked bowl, the misquoted sutra, the missed bell at morning meditation, all were welcomed into his joy. Some monks resisted at first. They had come seeking answers, not amusement. They had studied volumes, fasted for days, sat for hours in rigid posture. Suffering, they believed, was a badge of honor. Laughter seemed too casual. But Sopa's presence challenged that quietly. He never spoke against seriousness. He just offered another path. One night, during a fierce storm that cracked bamboo and flooded the kitchen garden, the monks huddled together, whispering their concern over ruined crops and broken tiles. Sopa stepped outside barefoot and stood in the rain until he was soaked through. Then he raised his arms to the heavens and shouted, "Even the sky weeps sometimes, but look how generous it is." When he returned dripping, he bowed and said, "Thank you for letting me borrow your robe, dear clouds." His laughter rang out, and slowly, tenderly, the others joined him, not in denial of the damage, but in awe of the moment's strange, sacred beauty. In Buddhist tradition, the Bodhi tree is the place of awakening, where Siddhartha became the Buddha, not by escaping suffering, but by seeing into its nature. It is said he sat through temptation and fear, through loneliness and doubt, and emerged not with fury, but with clarity and compassion. And perhaps that is what Sopa understood so deeply, that true awakening is not a solemn prize, but a reunion with the living world. That wisdom doesn't mean the absence of joy, but the full embrace of it. A joy that can weep, a joy that can fall silent, a joy that, when ready, erupts like a bell struck by kindness. Sopa's laughter beneath the Bodhi tree became legend, not because it was loud, but because it reminded people that the path to liberation is not only paved with fire and stillness, but with warmth and play and the tender absurdity of being human. In his final days, when his breath grew shallow and the temple quieted with anticipation, he beckoned the youngest monk, a girl who had only just taken her vows, and whispered, "Don't forget to laugh when you're sad. The lotus was born in mud, but it's the sun it dances with." Then he smiled one last time, closed his eyes, and was gone. But they say the leaves of the Bodhi tree still rustle differently on certain mornings, as if they too remember the man who sang to the earthworms, bowed to the clouds, and found enlightenment in a crooked grin. To walk the Dharma, then, is not to erase yourself, but to return to the world with gentleness so deep it overflows as joy, not blind happiness, but luminous mirth, the kind that knows impermanence and still chooses wonder. So laugh quietly or boldly, beneath trees or beside strangers. Let it ripple like water in sunlight. Let it be the sound of the heart remembering its lightness. The universe, after all, is listening, and sometimes the Dharma is not a question or a sermon, but a chuckle shared beneath the Bodhi tree. In a remote Himalayan village cradled by silence and stone, winter came not with warning but with weight. Snow fell like silence turned solid, slow, soft, relentless. The elders spoke of the mountain's breath changing. They could feel it in their bones, in the way the trees whispered uneasily. And though they had weathered many winters, this one was different. The clouds were thicker, the winds sharper, the quiet deeper. It was during such a winter that a novice monk named Tenzin lit a candle. The monastery perched at the edge of a steep ravine, a place known not just for its spiritual solitude, but for the constant threat of avalanches. The elders knew how to listen to snow, when to walk and when to wait. They trained their ears to the silence of danger. But Tenzin was young and unsure. He still bowed with hesitation, still woke in the middle of the night to question the emptiness behind the chants. On the third day of unbroken snowfall, the monks gathered to conserve warmth and food. The temple bell, usually vibrant with practice, was silent. Outside, the white hills were motionless, yet deep beneath the surface, the snow strained, pressed, waited. Tenzin, unable to sleep, wandered into the meditation hall and lit a single candle before the altar. It was a ritual gesture, one he had done many times before. But that night, the light seemed smaller than usual, fragile, trembling. The flame bowed and rose in quiet rhythm, as if breathing with the cold. He sat before it, shivering not just from the chill, but from the uncertainty that gripped him. What use is a single flame when the mountain is ready to fall? That was when he remembered a story his teacher once shared, spoken slowly during a walk beneath the pines. In the face of great collapse, the wise do not brace, they listen. And when it is time, they offer their light, not to change the storm, but to remain human within it. Tenzin didn't fully understand it then. But now, as the wind roared beyond the walls and the weight of snow creaked on the monastery's roof, the words landed differently. He gazed at the candle, and for the first time he did not see a symbol of resistance. He saw devotion, not loud, not defiant, simply present. Outside, the slope of the mountain began to shift. The snow gave way. A long, low rumble stirred the earth. It was not an explosion. It was surrender, slow, vast, inevitable. The monks, trained by seasons and silence, had already gathered in the inner sanctum, sheltered in stillness. They closed their eyes, not in fear, but in reverence for impermanence. And Tenzin too stayed seated. He did not flee. He did not scream. He simply watched the candle. Its flame danced once, fiercely, beautifully, and then vanished as the room trembled and the wind howled like a chant ripped open. When the morning came, the world was white. Part of the outer temple had collapsed beneath the avalanche. Trees were uprooted, paths erased. Yet deep within the temple, the monks emerged, brushing snow from their robes like dust from old books. No one was hurt, but all were changed. When they returned to the hall, they found Tenzin asleep at the altar, the stub of the candle beside him. His face, though pale with cold, was soft, at peace. The abbot said nothing at first. Then he walked to the altar, placed a fresh candle, and lit it. The flame flickered to life, and the monks bowed. Later that year, they carved a line into the wall where the snow had reached, not to mark disaster, but to remember the threshold, the place where inner stillness had met outer collapse, where a boy uncertain and afraid had sat with a candle, not to hold the mountain back, but to keep the heart open. In Buddhist teaching, the avalanche and the candle are not enemies. One is the force of nature, the other, the grace of presence. The mountain falls because it must. The candle is lit because we can. It is easy to believe that power lies in scale, in great revolutions or thunderous revelations. But the Dharma, the living Dharma, often moves more subtly. It arrives in the smallest acts, the meal offered in hunger, the hand held in grief, the breath noticed in panic, the candle lit when collapse is certain. Stillness does not mean inaction, and compassion does not mean fixing what is breaking. Sometimes it means bearing witness to the fall, with dignity, with tenderness, with the quiet insistence that love, though small, will show up again tomorrow. The candle may not survive the avalanche, but it does not light itself to survive. It lights itself to be true. In every winter of the soul, we each carry such a flame. And though the snow may fall heavy, and the winds may come sharp and sudden, there is still time to sit, to listen, and to light what little we can. This is not defiance, it is devotion. Certainly, here's the complete narration text for the subsection. The smile of the dying elephant, within your specified structure and tone. In the dry season of a forest, where the wind whispered through brittle leaves, and the sun lay like an open hand on the earth, an elephant named Kima grew old. She was known throughout the valley, not just for her size or strength, but for the serenity in her step. Each movement a poem, each pause a teaching. The monks of the nearby vihara often watched her from afar as she passed the outer groves, sometimes pausing at the boundary stones as if bowing to the invisible. For decades, Kema had walked the same paths to the lotus pond, to the fig tree, to the shaded corner where medicinal herbs grew wild. She never harmed a branch. She never broke the silence. It was as if the forest trusted her, and in return, she never forgot how to listen. But now her walk was slower. Her massive ears drooped, not from weariness, but from the soft surrender that comes with knowing time's arc is curving inward. Her body had begun to lean, subtly, like a boulder shifting its weight before sleep. She no longer climbed the hill to the sacred pond. Instead, she found a clearing near the edge of the forest, where the sun filtered through thin bamboo. She stood there one morning, unmoving for hours, the birds circling her shadow. And then, she lowered herself to the earth with the sound of falling breath. A young monk named Ravata, still new to robes and silence, heard the call of the birds and followed. He was not prepared for what he saw. A body so vast, so ancient, so still, lying in a golden patch of morning light. At first he feared she was already gone. But as he knelt near her face, he saw one dark, liquid eye open slowly. And then, impossibly, she smiled. It was not the smile of teeth or jaw. It was the soft curl of presence, something that traveled from her gaze into the quiet morning, into him. A smile like a bell without sound. A smile that said, "I am not afraid. I am home." Ravata sat beside her for hours, saying nothing. No sutras, no chants, only his breath and hers. In the fading light, she reached her trunk and gently placed it across his shoulder, so softly he nearly wept. Not from grief, but from the recognition that here, in this moment, there was no fear, only warmth, only stillness, only love too large to name. That night, under the watch of the stars, she passed. When the other monks arrived at dawn, they found Ravata sitting upright, his robe covered in dust and his eyes still wet. She smiled, he said. She knew. And so they did not move her, not at first. They lit incense, they bowed. They recited the Metta Sutta, their voices trembling like reeds in wind. For 3 days, animals came and went. A deer who lingered at her side, a crow who circled overhead, and finally a tiger who approached without growl, lay down near her feet, and left without a sound. In Buddhist teaching, the elephant has long been a symbol of awakened strength, firm, unwavering, compassionate in might. But Kema taught something deeper. Not the majesty of movement, but the grace of stillness, the wisdom of release, the joy of returning. It is said that the Buddha himself once paused his discourse to honor the dying of an old ox, noting that even an animal, when lived in mindfulness and dignity, may leave the world more gently than a man lost in thought. Death, in these stories, is not the enemy. It is the final bow, the great untying. When the monks built a stupa in the clearing where Kema had lain, they did not carve her name. They placed a simple stone, smooth and wide, and on it they wrote it. She smiled. It was enough. Even now, long after her bones returned to soil and the grass grew thick again. Visitors to the forest sometimes speak of a peace that overtakes them in that clearing. A quiet so complete it feels like a lullaby in the bones. Children, without knowing why, sometimes laugh there. Monks remove their sandals before entering, because in that place, one old elephant let go of the world without sorrow, and in doing so, she taught the living how to stay. To live in the Dharma is not to escape the body, but to return fully to it, even when it begins to dissolve. To smile not because there is no pain, but because one is no longer chained by it. Kema's gift was not in her death. It was in how fully she lived, how gently she walked, how lovingly she watched, and how clearly she understood that even endings are part of the great compassion. A smile given in the last breath, becomes a beacon for those still struggling to find peace in their own. So may we learn from her how to walk softly, and when the time comes, how to lie down with love. Certainly, here's the narration for the subsection, a tea ceremony for the unseen. In the early hush before sunrise, when the air holds its breath and even the birds wait for light, an old monk named Genshu began preparing tea. The monastery was quiet, wrapped in stillness like a robe freshly folded. Outside, the mist curled low along the stone path, blurring the line between the seen and unseen. Genshu moved slowly, his hands steady, his breath even, as he filled the kettle, lit the charcoal flame, and selected the cups, none matched. One was cracked. Another had been gifted by a traveler decades ago, the glaze worn smooth by countless palms. Each cup, like each soul, carried its own invisible history. He set 5 cups upon the wooden tray. Only one would be sipped. The others were for the unseen. In Japanese Zen, it is said that a tea ceremony is not a performance. It is an offering. And Genshu believed that true hospitality extended beyond what eyes can measure. It welcomed ancestors, wanderers, ghosts, spirits of the forgotten, even one's own past selves. He had long since stopped trying to explain this to the younger monks. Some thought him senile, others simply didn't ask. But every morning he brewed tea for guests who never knocked. One morning, a novice named Kaito stumbled upon the ritual. He had risen early, too restless to sit in meditation, and found the aroma of roasted leaves guiding him down the corridor. As he peeked around the screen, he saw Genshu bowing. Once, twice before the empty cushions. He waited, unsure whether to speak. Genshu, without turning, said softly, "Come." Pour gently. Kaito approached, bowing low, and lifted the pot. His hand trembled slightly. The tea flowed like a narrow stream into the first cup. Then the next, and the next. Genshu did not stop him. "Why 5 cups?" Kaito finally asked. Genshu smiled, not with amusement, but with memory. "One for who I am. One for who I was. One for those who cannot be here. One for those who never were. And one," he said, "for the silence that listens to us all." The boy looked down. "Do they drink it?" "Not with lips," Genshu said. "But yes, every drop is received." Kaito stayed that morning longer than he intended. The tea was warm, yes, but it was the presence that filled him. The ceremony unfolded like a slow exhale, pouring, sipping, bowing, breathing. And all the while something deep beneath his ribs loosened. Not in grief, exactly. Not in joy. Just release. Later, when he returned to his cushion in the meditation hall, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Held over time, Kaito returned often. Sometimes he helped. Sometimes he only watched. Years passed and seasons peeled away like old bark. Genshu's hands grew slower, his voice thinner, but the tea remained steady. Each morning, the 5 cups waited. One spring morning, the sun rose pink across the bamboo grove. Genshu did not rise. The room was quiet, his robes folded neatly by the door. The kettle was clean. The cups were arranged. Kaito found him sitting in the garden, his breath already gone but his face soft, serene. In his lap lay a small scroll. It read only, "Thank them for coming." The next day, Kaito lit the fire himself. He filled the kettle. He chose the same 5 cups. And when the tea was ready, he bowed, not only to the guests he could see, but to the countless others, his past, Genshu's memory. All those who had once loved, suffered, wandered, vanished. He did not feel alone. The Dharma teaches us that what we overlook is not always absent. That which is unseen may still be felt, like wind through pine, or kindness passed down from hand to hand through time. Compassion does not require acknowledgement. It only asks that we show up with sincerity. A tea ceremony for the unseen is not about ghosts or mysticism. It is about remembrance, reverence, inclusion so radical it bends the boundaries of space and time. It says, "Though you are not here in flesh, you are not forgotten." It says, "Though I cannot see you, I will not serve myself alone." In a world where so many feel invisible, where sorrow and memory often go uninvited, this practice becomes revolutionary in its tenderness. To offer tea is to say, you mattered, you still do. In this way, the Dharma walks quietly with us into kitchens and temples, into grief and gratitude. And sometimes, all it takes to remember this is 5 cups and 1 steady breath. Certainly, here is the narration for the subsection, breathing lighter return to compassion. The day bends toward dusk, and the sun, golden and unhurried, casts long shadows over the quiet ground. You have walked with us through stories carved not in stone, but in silence, kindness, and breath. Now we return, not to the place we began, but to the stillness we had forgotten was always there. It is time to breathe again, not merely with lungs, but with the whole of the heart. Compassion, in its truest form, does not end in gesture or story. It loops like the breath itself. Inhalation, exhalation, receiving, offering. We do not arrive at compassion, we remember it. We uncover it beneath the sediment of fear, hurry, pride, and pain. Like a lantern long buried beneath the soil, the light was never gone. It only waited for our hands to unearth it. The Buddha once spoke of the boundless states, the Brahmaviharas. Of these, Karu, compassion, is the one that ripens most gently. It is not explosive like joy, nor weighty like equanimity. It is soft, rippling quietly through the field of suffering like wind over still water. It sees the wound and does not turn away. It does not flinch, it stays. In this way, compassion is both the cradle and the fire. It is what holds and what transforms. Throughout the stories we have shared, of an elephant's smile, a cracked bowl, a beggar's offering, a robe passed to an outcast, you may have noticed something subtle. No one asked to be seen as extraordinary. None of the figures in these parables claimed power or title. Their compassion was not loud. It was not always recognized. Often it went unnoticed by the world, but it moved through them like breath moves through a flute, shaping a melody that outlives the player. That is the nature of real compassion. It does not seek acknowledgement. It arises spontaneously like dew on grass, and yet its effects echo through lifetimes. The breath is our simplest reminder. It returns us to the present, to our body, to this shared and tender moment. Breathe in and you receive the world. Breathe out and you give yourself to it. There is no compassion without this rhythm, no giving that does not also heal the giver. We live in an age where the edges of the world feel sharp. Speed, distraction, division, they fray the soft fabric of our attention. We are taught to measure worth in noise, achievement, accumulation. But compassion whispers. It lives in the unmeasured spaces. It slips between headlines, sits with the dying, kneels beside the broken, and listens where no one else does. To return to compassion, then, is not to become someone new. It is to come home. It is to recognize that the stranger on the train, the child at your knee, the opponent in debate, the quiet animal by your door, all are threads in the same tapestry, and not abstractly, not as metaphor, but in the raw, radiant reality of interbeing. This return is not always easy. There are days when the heart closes like a fist, when resentment feels safer than softness, but even then, we are not alone. The Dharma does not abandon us in our struggle. It reminds us that every breath is an invitation. Even the breath caught in grief, even the breath slowed by age, even the breath we hold when we cannot speak the truth. Let it go. Let it return. Let it teach you the rhythm of mercy. There is a Zen tale of a monk who, after years of meditation, was asked what he had gained. "Nothing," he said, "but I have lost the need to win. I have lost the wish to escape. I have lost the illusion that I am separate." Perhaps this is the gift of compassion too. Not something to possess, but something that possesses us gently, and with care, it holds us even when we cannot hold ourselves. You may wonder now, what do I do with this? After these stories, these hours of soft turning, what is the next step? It is this. Let the stories breathe through you. Offer tea to the unseen. Bow to the broken thing. Say thank you to the scar. Smile at the stranger who may never smile back. Listen to the silence between someone's words and hear their ache. Speak gently, even when the world shouts. And when you fail, because you will, begin again. Breathe again. The breath does not judge, nor does the Dharma. In the end, what these tales give us is not a map, but a mirror. Not instructions, but invitations. The choice always is yours. You are the one who will meet the tired neighbor. You are the one who will face the next sorrow. You are the one who can decide whether to close or to open. The dawn and the dusk are not opposites. They circle one another. The light returns, not because we chase it, but because we remember it lives within us. So breathe. Breathe with the memory of Kima the elephant. Breathe with the cracked bowl, the laughing monk, the widow with her rice grain. Breathe as one who knows. Compassion is the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your head. You are not outside of it. You are made of it. And it is waiting for you always in the simple kindness of a single breath. Certainly. Here is the complete narration text for the subsection, 3 bows in silence, a benediction, with the target of 1200 words, in alignment with the structure and tone. There are moments when words, having carried us so far, know they must now step aside. The tales have been told, the echoes of kindness, of humility, of small and radiant acts. The potter, the monk, the widow, the elephant, the unseen guest, have drifted through us like incense smoke. And yet, the deepest teachings are never spoken aloud. They are carried in silence. They are felt in the space between heartbeats. They unfold where the mind softens and the breath slows. In the Buddhist tradition, at the close of a long meditation or teaching, there is a gesture. It is not elaborate. It is not grand. It is simply this: 3 bows. 1 to the Buddha, 1 to the Dharma, 1 to the Sangha. Body folded, hands pressed, head lowered. But these bows are not of submission. They are not performed out of fear or obligation. They are offerings, acts of reverent humility. A soft, embodied poem whispered not with the tongue, but through the spine and soul. And so, now we too bow. The first bow is to the Buddha, not only the historical teacher who walked barefoot through forests and slept beneath trees, but the awakened nature in all beings. This is the bow to the possibility of transformation, to the knowing that every mind, no matter how tangled, can become clear, that every heart, no matter how bruised, can still open. In this bow, we remember that wisdom does not reside only in distant monasteries or ancient texts. It can arise in the silence of a mother nursing her child at midnight, or in the steady patience of a man repairing a fence for his neighbor. It lives in the homeless girl who gives half her bread to a stray dog, and in the teacher who listens to the same story again and again, because it matters to the one telling it. To bow to the Buddha is to bow to that spark of clarity that rises even when the night is longest. We lower ourselves, not because we are lowly, but because we recognize that awakening lives in all things, and we must look upward in order to see it everywhere. The second bow is to the Dharma, the teachings, the truths, the quiet pathways that bring us home. But the Dharma is not merely a scripture or a sermon. It is the world itself, each moment a scroll unfolding, every sorrow a syllable, every kindness a verse. To bow to the Dharma is to acknowledge that life itself is the teacher, that a cracked bowl can reveal more than 100 debates, that a crow's caw can interrupt delusion, that a drop of rain on a monk's shoulder can become a revelation. When we bow to the Dharma, we say, I will learn from what is before me. I will not wait for perfect teachings from perfect mouths. I will listen to the breath, the wind, the silence. I will be taught by the way my hands tremble, by the way my anger rises, by the way my love refuses to die. The Dharma, after all, is not only what is spoken, it is what is lived. The third bow is to the Sangha, the community, seen and unseen. This includes not only the monks in saffron robes or the nuns sweeping temple steps, but all who walk the path with sincerity, all who stumble, weep, rise again, all who reach out, quietly, without fanfare, to carry another across the stream. To bow to the Sangha is to bow to connection. It is to say I am not alone, even when my room is quiet, even when my suffering isolates me, even when I believe I am too broken to belong. There is always someone, somewhere, who understands, who has felt this pain, who has touched this hope, who has sat beneath the same sky and whispered the same longing. And so we bow to them all, the living, the dead, the teachers, the strangers, the friend who stayed, and the one who left, because they are us and we are them. And the path is not walked alone. These three bows are not the end. They are the soft return, the circle closing, not with a clang but with a breath, a petal falling, a bell ringing just once. If you are still with us now, let your body feel this gesture. You may not need to fold physically. Perhaps your bow is internal, a softening behind the eyes, a quiet place in the chest. You may bow to the morning light streaming through your window, to the cup of tea in your hand, to the memory of someone you've lost, to the child you once were, to the world as it is, flawed and aching and full of promise. Let your silence be the speech. Let your stillness be the praise. And know this: every bow given in truth ripples outward. It touches others in ways we will never see. A woman bows at dawn, and a boy on the other side of the world chooses not to raise his fist. A man bows in his grief, and a stranger walks more gently down the street. Compassion, once awakened, cannot be contained. It flows, like light through cracks, like water over stone, like song remembered in sleep. So as we end this long journey through stories, reflections and quiet truths, let this final silence be full. Let it be luminous. Let it be the kind of silence that says everything. 3 bows. One for the awakening that waits in each of us. One for the truth that walks with us even in darkness. And one for the community, visible and invisible, that holds us up, again and again, with love deeper than words. Thank you for walking this path. Thank you for listening, not only with ears, but with heart. May your days be touched by stillness. May your words be soaked in kindness. And may your life, however humble, be a story of compassion told quietly across the stars.